I love our little family.
She'd spent her life looking for love in all the wrong places.
She was the type that loved and loved hard.
All she really wanted to do was be accepted.
After several failed relationships, she wanted something different.
And she'd finally found it with a man who promised her a better life.
He was handsome, he was consistent.
He was everything that she wanted.
But their passionate love story will end in unimaginable tragedy.
The police arrive, they find her dead.
There were red marks consistent with the strangulation.
The neck looks like it's broken.
Who did this to her?
Did she fall prey to her troubled past?
He said she was on drugs and alcohol.
She was out of control.
Get out!
Or is the truth behind her death from a more present danger?
They realized the unfortunate truth.
He has been putting on a facade of this nice guy.
This life of chaos, or life of lies.
I know that you grabbed her off of that. I know that. And you told me what happened after.
August 23rd, 2018. It's a warm summer night in Marietta, Georgia, one of Atlanta's oldest and most charming suburbs, steeped in centuries of history and culture.
Marietta is a picturesque, southern, small-town, comfortable community in Atlanta.
Just good schools, nice area to raise a family.
But being so close to the big city, Marietta residents also deal with their fair share of crime.
It's a very busy urban area. Lots of people passing through, lots of traffic, high crime.
And tonight is no exception.
On August 23rd of 2018 at around 3:03 in the morning, officers got a 911 phone call.
Now, this is a kind of cryptic call.
No, what is your emergency?
Yeah, I need some squad. I need
He's saying that he wants the police to do a welfare check on Ziana Graham.
Ziana Graham was a local resident, a mother of 4. The 911 caller was saying she hadn't been answering any of his phone calls.
What do you need us to do for you?
I need you to come and evaluate the situation.
He didn't want to give his name, but he was definitely concerned.
He requested that officers go out to her address.
The police are concerned. Why do they need to go over there?
I need to know what I'm sending my officers into.
Oh, don't worry about it then.
So what's going on there?
Given the suspicious nature of the call, the operator immediately dispatches officers to Ziana's home.
911 dispatch hurriedly sends police to that location because they want to know what's going on.
Ziana might have been hurt.
When you're dispatched to a welfare check, you don't know what to expect.
24-year-old Ziana Graham had a heart that overflowed with love for the people in her life.
She had a very bubbly personality.
If she was your friend, she loved you deep.
Growing up in the northern reaches of the Bay Area, Ziana was a bright student who connected with people everywhere she went.
Ziana, she grew up on the West Coast in Vallejo, which is near Sacramento.
At a very young age, Ziana was a friendly person. She wanted to make friends with everybody that she met.
But when trouble reared its head at home, Ziana's strong spirit was put to the test.
I had a troubled marriage with her mother in the beginning of Ziana's life.
Her parents separated early on.
Instead of healing, time only brought more problems for the Graham family.
Her father was deployed shortly after 9/11, and upon return came back with issues around drug and alcohol abuse.
I began using drugs and drinking quite a bit.
Eventually, Ziana's mother was granted full custody, and her father sort of drifted out of her life.
I loved Ziana very much, But it's like the more it didn't work out for me, the more I turned to alcohol.
And Ziana wasn't far behind.
About the age of 12 or 13, she started using drugs, started hanging out with the bad crowd.
I take my part of the blame, unfortunately, but all she really wanted to do was be accepted.
Kind of got out of hand, and her mom couldn't handle it.
In an effort to help Ziana turn her life around, her family decided to make some big changes.
The only option was to turn her over to the grandma.
So they then migrated to Marietta, Georgia.
They went trying to get Ziana reestablished and put into school.
But life proved to be just as difficult in Georgia as it was in California.
She was doing really well. She had started going to school. She had stopped using drugs. But at the age of 15, she got pregnant.
Ziana decided to marry the father of her child and start a family.
There's nowhere else I want to be.
As a young mom, Ziana found what had been missing from her life.
She was so happy to be a mom. She knew this is what she wanted to do with her life.
She had her second child, and things seemed like they were going well for the two.
You did.
But after 4 years, Ziana's marriage crumbled.
Being young and then taking on additional responsibility of your children and then newly being married doesn't play well into the future.
They ended up getting divorced, and now Ziana is left with her 2 children.
That marked the beginning of a long string of failed relationships.
She was dating, but it wasn't going anywhere.
Ziana at 19 has a 3rd kid, and she and her 3rd child's father never created or maintained a relationship. And then she has another child by another person.
So by the time she's 24, she has 4 children.
As a single mom with 4 kids, life could be difficult.
Life was very stressful for her.
She's wondering, where do I turn for some relief?
Just as she was on the verge of hitting her breaking point, Ziana met someone new.
In the wake of all of that, she meets Chris Scarborough.
They actually met during Ziana's first day at her new job.
You gotta get it up here against the wall. No paint, no paint drip.
Ziana worked for Christopher, helping him paint.
I'll be a pro in no time, thanks to you.
Chris is from Raleigh, North Carolina, and had been living with his mother in Ackworth, which is maybe 20 minutes away.
Ziana and him hit it off.
He's a tall, dark, handsome man. He's older, more mature, and all of those things were appealing to Ziana.
Before long, their friendship blossomed into something more.
Their work relationship transitions to a more loving relationship.
Chris felt as if he wanted to be a part of not only Ziana's life, but now her 4 kids' life.
They're gonna love you. I already know.
Ziana knew she'd finally found what she was looking for.
She was just excited about what the relationship was going to bring.
But now, Marietta police are racing to Ziana's home after receiving a cryptic 911 call from an unknown source.
An anonymous call comes into 911 referencing a welfare check needing to be done at the residence.
When the police arrive, they knock on the door, and Ziana's grandmother answers.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. We're here to check on Ziana Graham. Is she here?
The grandmother was confused. She says Ziana is fine. She's asleep in her room.
Officers think it may be a prank call.
And well, we're sorry to bother you this late. Have a nice night.
Good night.
But as the police drive away, Ziana's grandmother gets a bad feeling.
She decides that she's gonna go check on Ziana.
Nothing could have prepared her for what she saw.
Oh, God. She found her granddaughter deceased on the ground.
Ziana! After overcoming her rocky childhood, 24-year-old Ziana Graham found purpose and joy as the mother to 4 beautiful children.
She loved being a mom. That's what she cared about most.
She was very passionate about her children.
But that didn't mean it was easy.
She's struggling to work, provide for her children.
She really could use a hand in raising this family that she has created.
So, when she met a kind-hearted construction worker named Christopher Scarborough, it seemed like a match made in heaven.
Ziana's excited because Christopher is everything that she wanted. He was a provider, he was loving.
She loved that he was secure, he was working, had a steady job.
She's ready to take care of her and her children.
She was hoping that this might be the one.
But now an anonymous 911 call has led Ziana's grandmother to make a horrifying discovery.
Oh, God!
When the police arrived, she turned them away initially because she didn't expect anything. But then that's when she went and discovered her granddaughter dead.
Ziana! She then called 911 back, explaining that her granddaughter was deceased.
Marietta police quickly returned to the residence,
She's trying to get to the door.
followed by homicide detectives.
Open the door.
Ziana's grandmother and her children were obviously very upset. So detectives arranged for them to be transported back to the station while they looked through the house.
Here, get the kids out.
When you first arrive at the scene, you're gonna take a look at the body. You're gonna determine if there's any injuries.
Ziana is laying on her back. Her hands are spread beside her body. Her neck looks like it's broken. And she has broken small red blood vessels in her eyes.
It's a clear sign that Ziana's death was no accident.
Petechian eye is a very clear indication of strangulation.
The big question was, who did this to her?
Hoping for a clue to her killer, officers set out to search the home.
They were going through it with a fine-tooth comb.
They're looking for, are there any signs of forced entry?
Are there weapons? Is there blood spatter? What in here is going to point us towards a suspect?
While they don't turn up any hard evidence, the investigators are able to eliminate at least one theory.
There was no signs of theft or any indication that someone wanted to break into the home.
By all indications, this wasn't a random attack. This was targeted.
But who would want to kill a doting mother like Ziana?
Police start recalling back to this very curious anonymous tip for welfare check. They didn't want to give any identifying information.
Could the man who called 911 also be the monster who took Ziana's life?
Thank you, sir. There you go.
So they requested a trace on that mysterious 911 call to try to figure out who that was that called in for this welfare check.
While they wait for the results, detectives head to the station to speak to Ziana's family.
They want to talk to those who were in the house, including the children. But due to this traumatic experience, it may be hard to get them to say anything.
Instead, they focus their attention on Ziana's grandmother.
I know this is going to be hard, but I got to ask you a few questions.
Of course.
She's frantic and she's confused.
She's trying to make sense of all these crazy events that just happened in her own home.
Can you think of anyone that may have wanted to hurt Ziana?
No, I just can't understand it.
She doesn't know who could have done this to Ziana.
Her granddaughter who never met a stranger, who was everyone's friend, who always was pleasant, who always was full of life. Why would anybody want to do anything to her?
Was there anyone new in Ziana's life?
Not that I know of. Unless you mean Christopher.
She explained that she was dating a Christopher Scarborough.
She told them that he was a construction worker. He helped around the house and did little small, tighter things.
She felt that he was a great guy. He was nice to her, the children, and Ziana. There's probably something I should tell you. Even though grandmother thought Christopher was great, there's a concern.
she revealed that Christopher had just gotten out of jail.
After mother of four Ziana Graham was strangled to death in her home, Georgia investigators suspect the killer could be someone she knew.
They started to thinking that maybe this is personal because there was no signs of theft or forced entry.
Now, detectives have just learned that Ziana's boyfriend of 7 months, Christopher Scarborough, was released from jail just 2 weeks before she was murdered.
Of course, the detectives were concerned because he has a criminal history.
Could that have been the person who did this?
What was Christopher's relationship with Ziana like?
Good, I think. He was there for her when she needed him.
Grandmother was trying to see the best in Chris as he was helping out around the house.
He was mowing the grass, he was making repairs in the home, just taking care of everything.
He seemed to bring a sense of stability, a sense of consistency to the family structure. He was really being like a man of the house kind of figure.
When's the last time you saw Christopher?
Last night, he came by to visit Ziana for a little bit.
She shared that Ziana's boyfriend, Christopher, stays with them from time to time, and he happened to be there last night.
However, he left, and that was normal because sometimes he would go to stay with his mother in Ackworth.
He's between 2 different households.
What was he like when he left?
Not sure. I didn't talk to him.
Grandma was already in bed at this point, but she heard him leave out the front door.
After detectives end their interview with Ziana's grandmother, they receive word that their trace of the 911 caller's cell phone has been completed.
The number that made the call turned out to be a prepaid phone without a real name attached to it.
They were able to get a GPS position for the device that made the 911 call, and the location rang a bell for the detectives.
The 911 call had come in from Ackworth.
Since Christopher has family in Ackworth, they thought maybe that's where Christopher was.
When they arrive at the GPS coordinates, their suspicions are confirmed.
They go to Ackworth, where they believe this is Christopher's mother's house. And guess what? He's there.
They let him know that they wanted to ask him questions about his girlfriend.
Is he on straight? I can speak with.
Initially, he was very upset. He had not heard from her, and he needed to know what was going on.
So what's he on there?
He stated that he was trying to contact her. She wasn't answering the phone, so he became worried about her.
When the investigators break the news that his girlfriend is dead, Christopher seems stunned.
Chris was genuinely shocked to find out that Ziana was gone.
They had this opportunity to ask him as many questions as they need because he is being so willing and cooperative.
How's your relationship with Miss Grant? Good?
He said he loves Ziana and her kids.
How long have you and her been seeing each other? 7 months. 7 months. Mm-hmm.
They fell deep and fast for each other.
But that doesn't mean they always got along.
Have you guys ever gotten into it with each other? And, I mean, everybody does, right? Sometimes.
He said, we fight, but that's normal. Most people fight in relationships.
And the night before Ziana was found dead was no exception.
He stated that very night they had gotten into an argument, and that was one of the reasons why he left.
Detectives asked, what were you arguing about?
No, you would act like this!
He stated that she was constantly picking a fight with him.
You just done? Okay. You said that argument got physical. Can you talk to me about that? Hit me and
Get out!
But Christopher tells detectives he kept his cool.
He was thinking that it was probably in his best interest to just let her calm down and they'll have a conversation later on.
He figured he would just go to his mom's house.
So he called him a ride share and left to go back to Ackworth.
When he walked out the door, Christopher says Ziana was still alive.
How was Ziana when you left? She was talking to you when you left? Okay.
He says she was upset, but she definitely wasn't dead.
Detectives aren't sure if they can believe him, especially since they suspect he made the anonymous 911 call that led them to Ziana's body.
If he didn't know Ziana was hurt, why would he have asked for a welfare check?
When they confront Christopher with their suspicions, he gives them an answer they weren't expecting.
They decided to ask him, and he admits to making the 911 call.
But not because he knew Ziana was dead.
Christopher said Ziana had relapsed.
He said she was out of control.
After he left, she stopped answering the phone.
He was concerned, and he needed to know what was going on.
He thought she might have overdosed.
Georgia construction worker Christopher Scarborough has admitted to fighting with his girlfriend, Ziana Graham, just a few hours before she was found dead in her home.
We were just arguing.
But he insists he didn't kill her.
When he left the house, he reported she was alive and well.
Christopher claims there was another reason why he asked police to perform a welfare check on his girlfriend that night.
According to him, Ziana had started using drugs again. He stated that she was out of her mind, going crazy.
Once he left the house, she wasn't taking his calls or answering his texts, so he thought she might have OD'd or something bad might have happened.
You wanted somebody to go check on her to make sure she was okay? Yeah.
He said he was trying to help.
He didn't want Ziana to find out he called the police on her, so that's why he said he refused to give his name to the 911 operator.
The information that Ziana had a drug problem comes as a surprise to detectives.
That opened a lot of new avenues for the investigation. Was this a drug deal that went bad? Has Ziana reached out to some unknown third party while she was under the influence?
The investigators are now thinking several different outcomes could have resulted in Ziana being strangled.
On top of that, Christopher's story appears to check out.
Chris, is your mother home?
Yeah.
Whoa!
The officers look into his alibi.
Police follow up with his mom, and she does confirm that he did stay with her the night before.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks. Have a good day.
Let's get his phone records and subpoena the rideshare company. Right.
They contact Uber, and they confirm that Christopher did leave Ziana's house that night.
The investigators thought he's told us what seems to be the truth.
With their sole suspect cut loose, the detectives start exploring other possibilities.
They want to try to track down if there's anybody that Ziana has been buying drugs from. Maybe this was a drug deal gone bad.
The detectives checked Ziana's phone records to see who she'd been in contact with.
It's another dead end.
Unfortunately, they don't find anything suspicious.
All of the numbers seem to be the regular people, her grandmother, her friends, Christopher. There weren't any concerns for any other numbers on her phone line.
Investigators next turn to Ziana's prior romantic relationships.
Jealousy can be a huge motive when you're looking at any murder case, especially one as personal as this one appeared to be.
They know that she was married, and they know that she has children with 3 other fathers.
So investigators start to think maybe we should just follow up on these other men that are in Ziana's life, see if there was any bad blood.
After obtaining contact information from Ziana's family, the detectives start making calls.
They make contact with her ex-husband, who she has 2 kids with, and he states that he no longer lives in Georgia.
He is very active in his children's life. They have a good relationship co-parenting.
The father of her youngest child, they co-parent very well, so he was cleared as well.
One of the fathers, on the other hand, they really don't have a great relationship.
He's not around. Maybe he's had something to do with this.
But when the detectives speak to him, they realize it's another false lead.
Turns out he has a really good alibi.
He was at work, alibi confirmed, and so he obviously could not have done this.
It's one more frustrating setback in an investigation that seems to be going nowhere.
The fathers of her children are all accounted for.
There was no evidence of a drug crime either, at least as far as the police could tell.
They don't know where to go at this point.
They were back to square one.
Homicide.
Until an unexpected new tip comes in.
They receive a call from the therapist that had been working with the children.
Officers, in order to get the interview with the children, contacted the Child Advocacy Center and scheduled for the children to be interviewed by a forensic interviewer.
A forensic interview is so there's no bias and there's no leading questions being asked to the children and kind of getting more of a truth from the children as far as what happened.
The therapist tells detectives that during her interview with Ziana's oldest son, he made a chilling statement.
He starts talking about some of the things that he remembers from the night that Ziana died.
I heard arguing and bumping noises.
Like a thud?
He had heard a loud snap.
Then, out of nowhere, he says he killed her.
Who did the snap?
Christopher.
He told the therapist that it was Christopher who killed his mother.
48 hours after Ziana Graham was found dead on the floor of her Marietta, Georgia home, the police investigation into her murder had slowed to a crawl.
It feels as if the trail is gone cold. Then they get a phone call.
The call is from a police therapist who's been working with the murdered woman's young children.
And as one of the children is talking to the therapist, he reveals a bombshell that could blow this case wide open.
Who did the snap?
Christopher.
According to her son, it was her boyfriend who killed her.
He told me it was Christopher who killed his mom.
The shocking accusation stuns law enforcement.
They had already interviewed Christopher and didn't think he had anything to do with this.
But now, they're starting to have second thoughts, especially when they hear the full extent of what Ziana's son said.
Well, apparently, this guy had been physically abusive.
He reported that Christopher had beat her previously.
He's witnessed Christopher hit her, chase her, choke her.
Even the children weren't safe from Christopher's abuse.
According to the older son, Christopher has hit him a few times.
And on the night Ziana died, the young boy said he heard a familiar sound. His mother and Christopher fighting.
He was downstairs, he heard them arguing, heard it got physical.
He remembers hearing a loud bang and jostling, some aggressive conversation.
Then he heard a snap. And he realized that was his mom's neck breaking.
He heard from upstairs when it happened.
That trauma is something he's going to process and be with him for the rest of his life.
It's a damning allegation from an innocent child who has no reason to lie. But is it enough to draw up murder charges?
Putting a child on the stand can present many challenges when it comes to a case.
Children can have trouble separating make-believe from reality, and so their testimony, it isn't always rock solid.
Well, after finding out the information from Ziana's son,
all right, pull everything we have on him.
The detectives felt that Christopher needed to be looked at deeper.
While Christopher's abuse had slipped past Ziana's grandmother, conversations with other family members revealed they had long suspected something was wrong in the couple's relationship.
Ziana and her father had started to build their relationship better, so she told him something just was not right with Christopher.
When I found out who he was, I knew it felt wrong.
Dad had a feeling that the two of them were involved in some type of domestic violence.
But Ziana struggled to see a way out.
Ziana confided in her father and said, I want to get out of this relationship, but I don't know how.
It's very hard for folks to, once they're in a relationship, to get out of the cycle of abuse.
When detectives receive Ziana's autopsy results, they further implicate her boyfriend.
It was determined that she didn't have any drugs in her system. She had been drinking, but it wasn't a large amount of alcohol.
That means Christopher was lying about Ziana using cocaine. Why would he do that? Unless, of course, he was trying to lead the police down a false trail.
At this point, they're definitely sure that it's him.
But what had pushed Christopher past the point of no return?
What set him off? Did Ziana finally tell him she was leaving him?
The investigators have a whole lot of new questions that need to be answered.
To their surprise, Christopher freely agrees to come in for a follow-up interview.
They tell him that they found some new information that they just want to confirm.
All right, Chris. I want to talk to you a little bit more about what we talked about earlier. Okay. We talked about the altercation that you and Mr. Graham had. You said that you were in the bedroom. Could you kind of go through that again with me?
Christopher begins by telling the investigators the same thing he told them last time.
He's still sticking to his story that they got into it, he left.
Okay. When the incident got physical, do you remember how it got physical or how it started? See, grab something in his face. Is that how you got the little mark on your cheek right here? No, yeah. Yeah? What did she swing at you, you know? I don't know. I was on the baby towards the
They pressed him for more information. What were you two fighting about that night?
Christopher seems reluctant to answer, but when he finally does, it's clear why.
You can start to see a shift in his personality.
You didn't tell me what the argument was about last night. No, it wasn't. It was what? About their boyfriend.
As evidence piled up against him, Christopher Scarborough continued to claim innocence in the murder of his 24-year-old girlfriend, Ziana Graham.
He's sticking with his story. Yes, we were arguing, but when I left the house, she was fine. She was alive.
But now he just admitted the shocking reason why he and Ziana were fighting. She had gotten an abortion without telling him.
Mr. Scarborough and Ziana had started dating approximately 7 months prior to this incident.
While they were together, Ziana got pregnant.
Christopher was very excited about the pregnancy. It would have been his first biological child.
But instead of celebrating new life, Christopher found himself mourning what could have been.
Ziana told him that she had lost a baby.
You said it was a miscarriage? A miscarriage.
He soon learned that was a lie.
He had gotten a Facebook message from someone very close to Ziana.
Somehow Ziana got an abortion.
That's how he found out that it was an abortion and not a miscarriage. And that's what triggered him.
You said that you guys got in this argument. Yeah. And then it was over the incident with her, with the abortion incident, right? Yeah.
He said he may have overreacted.
I can't believe you went behind my back.
I didn't go behind your back.
Yes, you did.
I did what was best for me.
Am I right?
He was really, really upset about this.
But he insists he didn't kill Ziana. until detectives start to roll out the evidence against him.
They hit him with the abuse and the statement from Ziana's oldest son.
They said, Christopher, we know you've done this. You need to come clean.
When you left there, she wasn't talking to you. And you know that. You knew it all along. I just need to know what happened. I know that you grabbed her on the neck. I know that. Can you tell me what happened after that? Did you throw her on the ground?
Christopher reported that Ziana was very angry that night. She was yelling, screaming. She hit him with a toy, and he was trying to calm her down. So the way he thought to calm her down was just to restrain her.
You grabbed her. How'd you grab her? Like this?
That's why I didn't tell you the truth, because I knew you would act like this.
She was pulling away from him, resisting him.
He admitted to putting his hands around her neck.
So you grabbed her on the neck. Did you squeeze her hard? Yeah. Do you remember how long you choked her?
Christopher began to cry, and he did admit that he strangled Ziana until he heard her neck break.
He said that he recognized that she was dead, lying on the floor, before he left the house and went to his mother's.
It's all the investigators need to hear.
At this point, the investigators have a full confession. They understand what happened, and Chris has admitted his role in Ziana's death. And they charge him with aggravated assault, malice murder, and cruelty to children because her 4 children were present at the home when all of this happened.
Christopher is left with few options.
Given all the evidence against him, given the fact that he has now confessed to his role in Ziana's death, it's starting to ring true that he will probably get whatever penalties are coming to him.
He talks to his attorney and finds out, because of his lengthy criminal history, that with this additional charge, it's possible for him to go to prison for life without parole. And he doesn't want that.
So he decides to cut a deal.
Christopher decided to take a plea deal instead of going to trial.
He pleads to malice murder and cruelty to children in the 3rd degree.
He was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole.
For Ziana's family, it's too little, too late.
I would have rather him gone to trial. I realized that now that he confessed and turned himself in and all that, his punishment could be a little bit less. That upsets me. Of course it would upset anybody.
The good news is, because of those felonies on his record, the possibility that he'll get parole is likely none.
In Georgia, he'd have to serve a minimum of 30 years before he would be eligible for parole. Ultimately, it's up to the parole board as to whether he will ever parole out.
Whether or not Christopher is ever released from prison, his violent actions will never stop reverberating through the lives of Ziana Graham's children.
They were in the house when it happened, and this is going to live with them for the rest of their life.
Those children, they never forget, that trauma follows them throughout their lives.
This was so much more than one murder. In a lot of ways, this was the destruction of an entire family.
I miss her so much.
44 years can erase almost everything. Faces change. Buildings disappear. Roads are widened. People move away. Detectives retire. Witnesses grow old. Memories become uncertain, but sometimes a single piece of evidence refuses to disappear, waiting silently for the day someone finally knows how to read it. On January 15, 1980, 19-year-old Barbara Mae Tucker was living a life that seemed ordinary from the outside. the kind of life that should have continued for decades. She was a student at Mount Hood Community College in Gresham, Oregon. She was young, surrounded by classmates and familiar places, with a future that had not yet been written. Nothing about that January evening suggested that her name would one day become attached to one of the region's most haunting cold cases. There was no warning that the next few hours would divide her life into a before and an after. There was no reason for anyone around her to believe they were witnessing the final moments of a young woman who would become the center of a murder investigation lasting more than 4 decades. That evening, Barbara was near the college campus. It was winter in Oregon, and darkness came early. The streets around the campus were quiet, the kind of quiet that could make a person notice every passing car, every movement at the edge of the road, every figure appearing and disappearing beneath the limited light. At approximately 7 o'clock, witnesses reported seeing a young woman near Northeast Kane Drive. She appeared distressed. She was waving toward passing vehicles. To anyone watching from a distance, it might have looked like someone needing help. But the witnesses could not possibly know how important those seconds would become. According to the investigation, a man emerged from nearby bushes and led the woman back toward the college ground. The image was brief, confusing, and frightening. A woman who appeared to need assistance. A man coming from the darkness. A movement away from the road and toward a more secluded area. Then the scene was over. Traffic continued, the night continued, and Barbara disappeared. The following morning, the ordinary rhythm of Mount Hood Community College was shattered. Barbara's body was discovered in a wooded area between Kane Road and a school parking lot. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten. The discovery immediately transformed the campus from a place associated with classes, students, and everyday routines into a crime scene. Investigators arrived and began working through the evidence. Every detail mattered. Where had Barbara been before she died? Who had seen her last? Who had approached her? Who was the man witnesses had seen near her? Was he the killer, or had the witnesses misunderstood what they were seeing? Detectives had questions, but answers were scarce. The crime had apparently unfolded quickly. The witnesses had seen only fragments. There was no modern surveillance network watching the surrounding street. There were no smartphones recording the movements of people nearby. There was no sophisticated digital trail capable of reconstructing the final hours of a victim's life. Investigators had to work with what they could physically find and what people could remember. That was the reality of homicide investigations in 1980. Every piece of evidence had to be located, documented, preserved, and interpreted using the forensic technology available at the time. And yet, somewhere inside the evidence collected from Barbara, something would survive for decades. At the time, nobody knew how important that evidence would become. Investigators could not see the future. They could not know that forensic science would eventually develop tools capable of extracting information from biological material that seemed almost useless by the standards of 1980. They could not know that genetic genealogy would one day allow investigators to search for distant biological relatives of an unidentified suspect. They could not know that a cold case detective decades later would look at the same evidence and ask an entirely different question. In the immediate aftermath of Barbara's murder, the priority was simple: identify the person responsible. Detectives worked the case. Witnesses were interviewed. Leads were examined. The crime scene was investigated. But the killer remained unidentified. As the initial urgency faded, the investigation entered the difficult territory familiar to so many unsolved homicide cases. The evidence remained, but the trail began to cool. Days became weeks became months. Then the calendar turned another year. Barbara S. family was left with an unbearable reality. Their daughter, sister, or loved one was gone, and the person responsible was still somewhere beyond their reach. There was no conviction, no courtroom, no final explanation, only an open question that would follow them into every anniversary that came afterward. The murder became part of the history of Gresham, but history did not mean resolution. A case can remain open on paper while becoming almost invisible in everyday life. People continue living. New crimes demand attention. Investigators change assignments. Departments evolve. Evidence is stored. Files accumulate. A case that once dominated the local community can eventually become a name on a list of unsolved crimes. But Barbara Reyes' case never completely disappeared. Investigators continued to preserve the evidence, and that decision would eventually become critical. In 2020 years after Barbara Reyes' murder, the case received a major forensic development. Biological evidence from the original investigation, including vaginal swabs collected during Barbara Reyes' autopsy, was submitted to the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory. The laboratory was able to develop a DNA profile. For the first time, investigators possessed a scientific identifier connected to the unknown perpetrator. It was a breakthrough, but it was also a cruel reminder of how close and how far away the answer could be. The profile existed. It could potentially be compared with known offenders. It could potentially identify the person responsible. But when investigators searched the available databases, there was no match. The unknown DNA remained unknown. The evidence had spoken, but it had not yet provided a name. This was the strange paradox at the heart of the case. Barbara Reyes' killer had left something behind. Investigators had preserved it. Scientists had extracted a usable genetic profile from it. And still, the person behind the profile remained invisible. It was as if the investigation had reached a locked door and discovered that it had the key but not the right way to use it. Years passed again. The case remained unsolved. Meanwhile, forensic science continued advancing at extraordinary speed. DNA databases grew. Laboratory techniques improved. Investigators became increasingly familiar with the possibility of using genetic information not merely to match a suspect, but to identify relatives and reconstruct family connections. Genetic genealogy was beginning to change the landscape of cold case investigation. Instead of asking only, "Who is this person?" investigators could begin asking, "Who might this person be related to?" That difference was enormous. A DNA profile that had once produced nothing could potentially point towards a distant relative. A distant relative could lead investigators to a family. A family could lead them to a specific individual. And suddenly, a case that had been silent for decades could begin moving again. In Barbara Tucker's case, the opportunity eventually arrived. Detective Aaron Turnage became involved with the investigation, and criminalist Deanna Grossi continued examining the evidence and researching new forensic possibilities. The case was no longer being viewed solely through the lens of 1980. Investigators now had more than 4 decades of scientific progress at their disposal. The question was whether that progress could finally transform Barbara Reyes' unknown killer from a faceless profile into a real person. The answer would eventually come from a technology that did not exist when Barbara was murdered. But before investigators could identify a suspect, they had to send the old evidence into a new world of forensic analysis. The DNA profile from Barbara Reyes' case became the starting point. Parabon Nanolabs was brought into the investigation for genetic genealogy testing. The purpose was not simply to search for an exact match. Investigators were looking for biological relatives who could provide a path toward the unidentified individual. Somewhere in the genetic data could be a connection that conventional databases had missed. Somewhere in the family history of an unknown person could be the clue that finally pointed toward Barbara Reyes' killer. For the people who had waited since 1980, this was another moment of uncertainty. There was no guarantee the technique would work. There was no guarantee the relatives would be close enough to identify. There was no guarantee the suspect was still alive. But the investigation continued, and eventually the genetic genealogy work produced a lead-pointing investigators toward a man named Robert Arthur Plimpton. After more than 4 decades, Barbara Reyes' unknown killer finally appeared to have a name, but investigators understood the difference between a lead and proof. A genealogical connection could point them towards someone, but the case would require stronger evidence. They needed confirmation. They needed DNA directly connected to the man. They needed something that could stand up in court. And so the investigation moved quietly toward its next stage. Detectives located Plimpton and began surveillance. They watched his movements. They waited for an opportunity to obtain discarded biological material. They knew that something as ordinary as a cup, a cigarette, or a piece of chewing gum could potentially contain the DNA they needed. Eventually, that opportunity came. Plimpton discarded a piece of chewing gum. Investigators recovered it. The gum was sent for testing. The comparison would become one of the most important moments in the entire investigation. More than 40 years after Barbara Tucker was murdered, the evidence collected from a discarded piece of gum could potentially answer the question that had haunted investigators since that winter night in 1980. The past was about to collide with modern forensic science, and for the first time, the unknown profile from Barbara Ray's case was no longer floating without an identity. It was about to be compared with the DNA of a living man. The result would determine whether the name Robert Arthur Plimpton was merely an investigative lead or the name investigators had been searching for since Barbara Ray's death. The investigators had a name, but a name was not yet an answer. In a case that had remained unresolved for more than 4 decades, every step had to be precise because one mistake could allow the entire investigation to collapse. Robert Arthur Plimpton had emerged from genetic genealogy as a likely contributor to the unknown DNA profile recovered from Barbara Tucker, but detectives knew that genetic genealogy was an investigative lead, not the final piece of proof. They needed confirmation. They needed a direct biological comparison. And so, in 2021, the Gresham Police Department began watching the man whose name had suddenly appeared in a case that had been silent since 1980. For Barbara Ray's family, this was the kind of development they had spent years hoping for, and perhaps years fearing. A suspect meant the possibility of justice, but it also meant reopening memories that had never really closed. For investigators, however, emotion could not determine the next move. Evidence had to. The DNA profile recovered from Barbara Ray's autopsy had already survived more than 20 years before scientists were able to develop it in 2000. It had then survived another 2 decades while investigators searched for a match. Now, modern genetic genealogy had finally pointed toward Plimpton. The question was brutally simple. Was he actually the man whose DNA had been recovered from Barbara Ray's body? Detectives located Plimpton living in Troutdale, Oregon, and began surveillance. They did not immediately confront him. They watched. They waited. They needed an opportunity to obtain DNA that could be tested against the profile preserved from the original investigation. The strategy was quiet, almost invisible. No dramatic confrontation, no announcement, just surveillance and patience. Then, one day, investigators saw Plimpton spit a piece of chewing gum onto the ground. To most people, it would have been meaningless. A tiny piece of discarded waste, something that would normally be stepped over and forgotten within seconds. But to detectives working a 40-year-old murder, it was potentially invaluable. They collected the gum and submitted it to the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory. The object carried something investigators desperately needed: biological material containing Plimpton's DNA. The laboratory compared the profile developed from the gum with the DNA profile that had been developed years earlier from vaginal swabs collected during Barbara Tucker's autopsy. The comparison was no longer based on a family tree or a statistical possibility. It was direct. The old evidence and the new evidence could now be placed against each other. One profile came from evidence collected after Barbara Ray's death in 1980. The other came from an object discarded by a living man in 2021. More than 40 years separated the two pieces of evidence, but DNA does not care how much time has passed. The laboratory determined that the DNA from the chewing gum matched the DNA profile from Barbara Ray's body. The unknown biological profile finally had a confirmed identity. Robert Plimpton was no longer merely a genealogical lead. Investigators now had a direct DNA match connecting him to the biological evidence recovered from Barbara. On June 8, 2021, Plimpton was arrested and charged with Barbara Tucker's murder. The arrest marked a stunning turning point in a case that had seemed destined to remain unresolved. But an arrest did not erase the decades of uncertainty. It did not automatically answer every question about what happened that January night, and it did not immediately end the legal process. The case had to move from the investigative world into the courtroom where evidence would be tested under the strict standards of criminal law. Plimpton requested a trial before a judge rather than a jury. That decision meant Judge Amy Baggio would ultimately determine whether the prosecution had proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The proceedings would revisit events that had taken place more than 40 years earlier. Witness memories would be examined. Evidence collected in 1980 would be discussed. The development of the DNA profile in 2000 would become important. The genetic genealogy work performed decades later would be explained, and the discarded piece of chewing gum would become one of the most remarkable objects in the prosecution's case. For investigators, the story of the gum was not simply about luck. It represented the intersection of old-fashioned detective work and modern forensic science. The original evidence had been preserved. A laboratory had eventually been able to extract a usable DNA profile. A conventional database search had failed. Years later, a new investigative technique had produced a possible family connection. Detectives had then conducted surveillance and obtained a new sample. The laboratory comparison had confirmed the connection. Each stage depended on the one before it. Remove any link, and the chain might have broken. That was what made the Barbara Tucker investigation so extraordinary. The murder had not been solved by one magical discoverer. It had been solved through persistence across generations of investigators and scientists. But while the forensic evidence was becoming stronger, the courtroom still had to determine what it meant. The prosecution presented its case during a 3-week trial that began in late February 2024 and continued into March. More than 44 years had passed since Barbara Ray's body was discovered near Mount Hood Community College. The case that had begun as an active homicide investigation in 1980 had become one of the oldest cold cases in Gresham history. Yet now, the evidence was being examined in a courtroom. The prosecution was represented by Chief Deputy District Attorney Kirsten Snowden and Senior Deputy District Attorney Todd Jackson. The defense had the opportunity to challenge the evidence and the prosecution's interpretation of the event. For the court, the question was not whether the story was shocking. It was not whether the public had waited a long time for an answer. It was whether the evidence established Plimpton's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The passage of time created an unusual problem. Memories from 1980 were being examined in 2024. Witnesses who had been young when Barbara died were now decades old. Details that had once been immediate were now part of distant history. But physical evidence does not age in the same way. Human memory does. The DNA profile developed from Barbara Ray's body remained a scientific record of what investigators had recovered. The laboratory results from the chewing gum provided another scientific record. Together, they created a bridge between the crime scene and the suspect. The courtroom, therefore, became the place where 44 years of investigation converged. The story that had begun on a dark January evening was now being reconstructed through evidence. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the scientific connection between Barbara and Plimpton. But the broader investigation also mattered. Witnesses had reported seeing a young woman waving toward traffic on Northeast Kane Drive before a man emerged from nearby bushes and led her back toward the college. The next morning, Barbara was found dead in a wooded area between Kane Road and a school parking lot. Investigators had determined that she had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. The original investigation had failed to identify the killer. In 2000, forensic science created a DNA profile. In 2021, genetic genealogy pointed toward Plimpton. Surveillance produced the chewing gum. The laboratory confirmed the match. The arrest followed, and now the judge had to determine whether all of those pieces formed a legally sufficient case. For Barbara Ray's family and friends, the trial represented something almost impossible to imagine after so many years. Hearing Barbara Ray's name spoken in court in connection with a murder charge that finally had a defendant attached to it. For investigators, it was the culmination of years of work. Detective Aaron Turnage had been assigned to the case in 2015, and criminalist Deanna Grossi had continued reviewing the physical evidence and researching advances in forensic investigative technique. Their work was part of a much longer chain of effort. Different investigators had handled the case over the decade. Different technologies had been tried. Different generations had inherited the same unanswered question. But the case remained open. According to the Gresham Police Department, the investigation had also been affected by practical challenges, including budget constraints and staffing shortages. Detectives were responsible for new cases while continuing to work older homicides. Cold cases could not always receive the same resources as active investigations. Yet Barbara's case remained alive. The evidence was still there, the DNA profile was still there, and eventually the right combination of technology and investigative persistence transformed what had once been an unidentified profile into a specific suspect. The courtroom now represented the final test. On March 15, 2024, Judge Baggio delivered her verdict. Robert Plimpton was found guilty of murder in the first degree and 4 counts of murder in the second degree. The verdict brought the 44-year investigation to its formal conclusion. A case that had begun when Barbara Tucker was 19 had finally produced a conviction. But the story did not end with the word guilt. There was still sentencing. There were still questions about what justice could mean after such an extraordinary passage of time, and there was the reality that no courtroom decision could restore the years Barbara had lost or return her to the people who loved her. The verdict could establish accountability. It could close the legal investigation, but it could not erase the grief. On October 3, 2024, Plimpton was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years to be served. He was immediately transferred into the custody of the Oregon Department of Corrections. For a case that had spent decades suspended between hope and despair, the sentence represented the final legal chapter. Yet the most astonishing part of the investigation remained the evidence itself. In 1980, nobody could have predicted that biological material collected during Barbara's autopsy would remain useful more than 40 years later. In 2000, investigators finally developed a DNA profile, but the databases of the time could not identify its source. In 2021, genetic genealogy created a new pattern. Then detectives watched a suspect discard a piece of chewing gum. That ordinary object became the bridge between the past and the present. The case had waited for technology. It had waited for investigators willing to reopen old files. It had waited for a laboratory capable of reading information that earlier generations could not fully use. And when those pieces finally came together, the mystery surrounding Barbara Tucker's murder could no longer hide behind the passage of time. The killer had not disappeared completely. His DNA had remained, the evidence had remained, and for more than 4 decades, while the world around the case changed, those microscopic traces waited for someone to connect them. The night Barbara died had become a distant memory for most people who knew about it. But inside the evidence, the story had never stopped. It had simply been waiting to be read. For more than 40 years, the identity of Barbara Tucker's killer existed in a place nobody could see. It was not written on a piece of paper. It was not recorded in a confession. It was not sitting inside a police database waiting for an investigator to type the right name. It was hidden inside biological evidence collected after Barbara's murder, locked inside a genetic profile that investigators could read but could not yet connect to a person. That distinction mattered. Having DNA evidence is not the same as knowing who left it behind. In Barbara's case, investigators had something extraordinary and frustrating at the same time. They had a genetic fingerprint belonging to the unknown person whose biological material had been recovered from Barbara, but the profile did not produce a conventional database match. The science had reached the door. The identity was still on the other side. Barbara had been murdered in 1980, long before genetic genealogy became a powerful investigative tool. At the time, detectives could document the crime scene, collect biological evidence, photograph the location, interview witnesses, and preserve material that might someday become useful. But they could not predict how dramatically forensic science would change. They could not know that decades later, investigators would be able to take an unidentified DNA profile and search for relatives of the person who left it behind. That possibility would eventually change the direction of the case. But first, there had to be a reason to reopen the old evidence. There had to be investigators willing to look again. There had to be someone asking whether a case that had remained unsolved for decades could still contain an answer. In Barbara's case, that persistence became increasingly important as the years passed. Detective Aaron Turnage became involved in the investigation in 2015, while criminalist Deanna Grossi continued working with the physical evidence and researching modern forensic possibilities. They were not beginning with a clean slate. They were inheriting a case that had already passed through the hands of investigators from another generation. The original crime scene was gone. The witnesses were older. Some people connected to the case had died. Others had moved away. Memories that once seemed sharp had become distant, but the evidence was still there. That was the advantage of a cold case. Time can destroy human recollection, but properly preserved biological evidence can remain remarkably stable. The investigators understood that the old DNA profile might hold more information than anyone had been able to extract from it before. The question was how to use it. Genetic genealogy offered a possible answer. Unlike traditional forensic DNA searches, which typically look for a direct match between an unknown profile and a person already represented in a law enforcement database, genetic genealogy can work through relative. An unidentified individual may never have entered a criminal database, but a distant biological relative might have submitted DNA to a genealogy service for completely unrelated reasons. That relative could become the starting point of a family tree. Investigators could then work backward and forward through generations, narrowing possibilities until the unknown individual could potentially be identified. It was not a shortcut. It was a complex process requiring careful analysis, genealogical research, and traditional detective work. But for a case like Barbares, it created something that had not existed in 1980 or even 2000. Another route toward the identity of the unknown suspect. The investigation eventually turned to Parabon Nanolabs, a company known for forensic genetic genealogy work. The old DNA profile from Barbares' case was examined using newer techniques. Investigators were no longer asking the databases for the exact person who had left the DNA. They were asking whether the DNA could reveal a family connection. That difference changed everything. The unidentified profile suddenly became more than an isolated genetic signature. It became a potential family map. Somewhere behind the DNA could be parents, grandparents, siblings, cousins, or more distant relatives. Somewhere inside that network could be the man investigators had been looking for since January 1980. The genealogical research eventually pointed toward Robert Arthur Plimpton. The name did not arrive with the certainty of a courtroom verdict. It was an investigative lead. That meant investigators had to proceed carefully. They could not simply announce that they had solved the case. They needed to establish whether the man identified through genetic genealogy was truly connected to the DNA recovered from Barbara. The investigation therefore moved into surveillance. Plimpton was located in Troutdale, Oregon. Detectives watched him without immediately revealing why. They needed an uncontaminated DNA sample. The goal was simple: obtain biological material that could be compared directly with the old profile. It was a strategy that depended on patience. Detectives did not need to force an interaction. They needed Plimpton to leave something behind, and eventually he did. He discarded chewing gum. The moment was almost absurdly ordinary. People discard chewing gum every day without thinking about it. A small gesture, a piece of waste, something that disappears into the environment and is forgotten, but investigators understood exactly what it could contain. Saliva can carry DNA. That DNA could potentially establish whether the man they had been watching was the same person whose genetic profile had been recovered from Barbarea's body. Detectives collected the gum and sent it for laboratory analysis. The next stage belonged to forensic science. The DNA from the gum was compared with the DNA profile developed from the evidence collected during Barbarea's autopsy. The comparison was direct and potentially decisive. The genetic genealogy investigation had suggested a person. The surveillance operation had produced a biological sample. Now the laboratory had to determine whether the two profiles matched. When the result came back, the investigation changed forever. The DNA from Plimpton's chewing gum matched the DNA profile developed from Barbarea's case. The genetic lead had been confirmed through direct comparison. The person whose DNA had remained unidentified for decades now had a name: Robert Arthur Plimpton. For investigators, it was an extraordinary breakthrough. For Barbarea's family, it represented something far more complicated. The answer they had wanted for decades had finally arrived, but answers in murder cases are rarely simple. Knowing who was responsible does not undo the crime. It does not erase the image of the victim. It does not restore the lost year. It does not return the 19-year-old woman who had walked into the January night in 1980 and never came home. But the identification meant something that had seemed impossible for years. The question who killed Barbara Tucker finally had an answer supported by DNA evidence. On June 8, 2021, Plimpton was arrested and charged with Barbara Ray's murder. The arrest sent the decades-old case into a new phase. The investigation was no longer only about identifying an unknown killer. It was now about proving the case in court. That would require prosecutors to reconstruct events from more than 40 years earlier and demonstrate that the evidence established Plimpton's responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. The passage of time would become one of the most striking features of the prosecution. In 1980, Barbara was 19. By 2021, the world around the case had changed almost beyond recognition. The people who had been young when she died were now middle-aged or elderly. The technology used to identify the suspect did not exist when the crime happened. Even the concept of searching genealogy databases for an unknown perpetrator would have sounded impossible to investigators working the case in its earliest days. Yet the original evidence had survived long enough for that future to arrive. This is what makes cold cases so unsettling. A murder can become old without becoming less important. The crime does not age in the same way the victim's family does. The unanswered question can remain exactly the same while everything else changes. Barbara was still 19 in every photograph. Her family still had the same unanswered question. The evidence still pointed toward the same unknown biological contributor. Only the tools had changed. The arrest also meant that investigators could finally place the name Robert Plimpton alongside the evidence that had haunted the case for decades. But the legal process would test more than the DNA. Prosecutors would have to establish the circumstances surrounding Barbara Ray's death and explain how the scientific evidence connected Plimpton to the crime. Defense attorneys would have the opportunity to challenge the evidence, the interpretation of the DNA, and the conclusions drawn by investigators. The case would ultimately be decided in court. For now, however, one thing was undeniable. The cold case had moved. The old file was no longer simply an unsolved murder investigation. It was a criminal prosecution. The man investigators believed responsible was no longer an unidentified figure. He was under arrest, and the DNA evidence that had waited for decades had finally led detectives to a specific person. The irony was almost impossible to ignore. For years, the investigation had been searching for a person, but the answer had been inside the evidence all along. It had been sitting quietly, preserved from a crime that had happened more than 4 decades earlier. The technology of 1980 could not fully unlock it. The database search in 2000 could not identify it. But the science of the 21st century could follow the genetic trail, and that trail led investigators to Robert Arthur Plimpton. Yet even then, the most difficult question remained. Would the evidence be enough to secure a conviction? An arrest could make headlines. A DNA match could change an investigation, but only a court could determine guilt. Barbara Ray's case was moving toward that final test, and the courtroom would eventually have to examine the evidence piece by piece. The witnesses, the forensic findings, the genetic genealogy, the chewing gum, the DNA comparison, the circumstances surrounding Barbara Ray's final hours. Every detail would matter, because after 44 years, the investigation had finally found a suspect. Now it had to prove that the suspect was the killer. For decades, Barbara Tucker's murder existed in the uncomfortable space between memory and evidence, between a crime that everyone knew had happened and an identity nobody could prove. The investigation had survived the passage of time, but survival was not the same as progress. For years, detectives had been forced to confront the same problem. The killer had left biological evidence behind, yet the available technology could not turn that evidence into a name. The breakthrough that finally changed everything did not happen overnight. It was the result of years of preserving evidence, revisiting old files, advancing forensic science, and refusing to treat an old homicide as a forgotten crime. When Detective Aaron Turnage became involved with Barbara Ray's case in 2015, he was not simply looking at a file from the past. He was looking at a question that had remained unanswered for more than 3 decades. Who was the man connected to the DNA recovered from Barbara? And why had he never been identified? The original investigation had been conducted in a completely different era. There were no modern genealogy databases available to investigators. DNA analysis was not the sophisticated investigative tool it would eventually become. Detectives depended heavily on witnesses, physical evidence, interviews, records, and traditional investigative technique. When those methods failed to produce a suspect, the case became a cold case. But the label did not mean the investigation was dead. It meant the investigation had reached a point where the available evidence could no longer provide the answer. The distinction was important because evidence can outlive the limitations of the technology being used to examine it. That was exactly what happened with Barbara. The biological evidence recovered after her death remained preserved. Years later, investigators submitted the vaginal swabs from her autopsy to the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory. In 2000, scientists successfully developed a DNA profile from that material. It was a major achievement, especially considering the age of the evidence. But the profile did not produce a conventional database match. Investigators now had a genetic profile belonging to the unknown contributor, but no identity. The case had gained a powerful piece of evidence without gaining a suspect. It was an agonizing kind of progress. Scientists could say, with increasing confidence, that the DNA belonged to a particular individual, but they could not say who that individual was. The profile remained anonymous. The investigation, therefore, continued in the background. Forensic technology advanced. This period was crucial. The world of criminal investigation was beginning to change rapidly. DNA databases expanded. Laboratory methods became more sensitive. Genetic genealogy emerged as a new tool for identifying unknown individuals in serious crimes. Investigators who had once been limited to direct database comparisons could now consider family connection. A person might never have been arrested, never have submitted DNA to a police database, and never have appeared in any traditional criminal record. Yet, a relative might have voluntarily uploaded genetic information to a genealogy service. That relative could unknowingly create a pathway toward identifying an unknown suspect. For cold case investigators, the possibilities were enormous. But genetic genealogy did not magically solve every case. It required a usable DNA profile. It required relatives to appear in the relevant databases. It required genealogists to interpret the relationships correctly. It required investigators to verify the resulting lead through traditional police work. And most importantly, it required patience. Barbara's case had already taught investigators that patience was unavoidable. More than 40 years had passed since the night she was killed. Another few months of surveillance or laboratory analysis was nothing compared with the years the family had already endured. When the genetic genealogy investigation eventually pointed toward Robert Arthur Plimpton, detectives did not immediately consider the case finished. They needed confirmation. The old DNA profile had to be compared with new biological evidence from Plimpton himself. This was where traditional investigative work and modern science came together. Detectives located Plimpton in Troutdale, Oregon. They watched him carefully. Their objective was not simply to observe him. They needed a sample that could establish a direct DNA connection. Eventually, Plimpton discarded chewing gum. Investigators recovered it and submitted it for analysis. It was an ordinary object carrying extraordinary significance. A small piece of gum could contain enough biological material to identify the person who had discarded it. Laboratory comparison produced the result investigators had been waiting for. Plimpton's DNA matched the DNA profile developed from evidence associated with Barbara's murder. The genetic genealogy lead had now been supported by direct DNA evidence. The unknown contributor was no longer unknown. Robert Arthur Plimpton was identified. The next question was whether prosecutors could turn that identification into a conviction. The answer would depend on the courtroom. Plimpton was arrested on June 8, 2021, and charged with Barbara's murder. The arrest came more than 41 years after Barbara's death. It was an extraordinary moment in a case that had been unresolved for most of a lifetime. But the arrest itself was only the beginning. The investigation now had to withstand legal scrutiny. Every piece of evidence would be examined. Every conclusion would be challenged. The prosecution would have to explain how the DNA evidence connected Plimpton to Barbara, while the defense would have the opportunity to question the reliability and meaning of the evidence. The case eventually proceeded to trial in 2024. By then, the passage of time had become almost surreal. The murder had occurred in 1980. The suspect had been identified through 21st century forensic technology. The trial was taking place more than 4 decades after the original crime. A courtroom was being asked to reconstruct events that had occurred when an entirely different generation was living through an entirely different world. Yet the central evidence remained remarkably consistent. Barbara had been found dead near Mount Hood Community College. Biological evidence had been collected. A DNA profile had eventually been developed. That profile had failed to produce a conventional match. Genetic genealogy had generated a lead. Surveillance had produced a discarded piece of chewing gum. The gum had produced a DNA profile that matched the old evidence. These were not isolated facts. They formed a chain. The prosecution's task was to present that chain clearly enough for the court to understand what it meant. For Barbaret's family, the legal proceedings also represented a moment they had perhaps never expected to see. For decades, there had been no defendant sitting in a courtroom, no one to confront, no one legally accused of killing Barbara. The case existed primarily in the realm of memory and investigation. Now, the courtroom gave the family something tangible. There was a defendant. There was evidence. There was a legal process. But even with those developments, the emotional reality remained painful. Barbara could not testify. She could not describe what happened that night. Her family could not recover the years that had passed without answers. The trial could determine responsibility, but it could not reverse history. The court, nevertheless, had a responsibility to separate emotion from proof. A murder investigation can produce overwhelming public reactions, especially when a cold case is solved after decades. But a criminal conviction requires more than a compelling story. It requires evidence sufficient to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That standard was at the center of the trial. The prosecution presented the scientific evidence and the investigation that had led to Plimpton. The defense challenged aspects of the case. The judge listened to the evidence and evaluated the arguments. And as the trial continued, the 44-year gap between crime and courtroom became one of the most remarkable aspects of the proceeding. In most murder cases, investigators have the advantage of recent memories, fresh records, immediate forensic opportunities, and witnesses who can describe events while they remain vivid. Barbaret's case had none of those advantages. Time had taken its toll. Yet the DNA evidence remained. The science had essentially created a bridge between 2 different eras. On one side was 1980, when Barbaret's life ended and the investigation began. On the other was 2024, when a courtroom finally examined evidence capable of identifying the person connected to her murder. Between those 2 points were decades of unanswered questions. There were investigators who came and went. There were technological developments that changed what was possible. There were moments when the case had little apparent movement, but the evidence never stopped existing. That is one of the defining features of cold cases. They can become quiet without becoming empty. A file can sit untouched for years while containing exactly the evidence that will eventually solve it. The breakthrough may depend not on discovering something new, but on discovering how to understand something old. Barbaret's case demonstrated that principle with extraordinary clarity. The DNA profile had existed before genetic genealogy. The biological evidence had existed before modern forensic databases. The connection had been physically present long before investigators knew how to find it. What changed was the ability to interpret it. And once investigators had identified Plimpton, the decades-old mystery entered its final stage. The trial would determine whether the evidence could withstand the highest level of scrutiny. The judge would have to decide whether the prosecution had proved its case. Barbaret's family would have to sit through a legal process concerning events that had shaped their lives for more than 40 years, and the defendant would finally face the consequences of an investigation that had begun before many of the people in the courtroom were even born. The case that had refused to die was now approaching its final confrontation with the truth. In March 2024, after a 3-week trial, Judge Amy Boggio found Robert Arthur Plimpton guilty of first-degree murder and 4 counts of second-degree murder. The verdict formally transformed Barbara Tucker's case from an unsolved homicide into a solved murder with a conviction. The answer had arrived after more than 4 decades, but the road to that answer had exposed something deeper about the nature of justice. Justice can be delayed by technology. It can be delayed by missing information. It can be delayed by the limits of an era. But evidence can remain. And when investigators return to it with better tools, an old mystery can suddenly become a living investigation again. Barbaret's case had survived because someone preserved the evidence. It survived because investigators kept the file open. It survived because scientists developed better ways to analyze DNA. And it survived because detectives were willing to follow a genetic clue toward a man who had remained outside the reach of conventional databases. The final identification may have seemed sudden when it made headlines, but the truth was much slower. It had taken decades. It had taken generations of investigators. It had taken science catching up with evidence collected in another century. And it had taken a single discarded piece of chewing gum to connect a living man to a DNA profile that had been waiting since 1980. The mystery was no longer a mystery, but the question of what justice meant after 44 years was only beginning to emerge. For Barbara Tucker's family, the passage of time was not measured in forensic breakthroughs or police reports. It was measured in birthdays that came without her, holidays with an empty place in the family, photographs that never changed, and the unbearable knowledge that the young woman they remembered would remain 19 forever. While investigators continued to search for answers, life moved forward around the family. Decades passed. Generations changed. Yet one question remained frozen in place. Who had killed Barbara? On January 15, 1980, that question had been immediate. By the time the 20th anniversary arrived, it had become part of a much longer nightmare. By the time scientists developed a usable DNA profile in 2000, the investigation had already outlived an entire generation of technology. And when that profile produced no conventional match, the family was once again forced to confront the possibility that the answer might remain hidden indefinitely. The tragedy of a cold case is not simply that there is no arrest, it is that there is no final version of events. Families are left alive with possibility. They can know how their loved one died, but not who was responsible. They can know where the body was found, but not exactly what happened before that moment. They can know investigators are searching, but they cannot know whether the next lead will come tomorrow or never. Barbaret's family endured that uncertainty for more than 4 decades. The murder remained an open wound in Gresham, Oregon, and every anniversary brought the same terrible reminder that time had passed without justice. Yet the evidence connected to Barbara did not disappear. That distinction would eventually become the foundation of the case. The vaginal swabs collected during Barbaret's autopsy had been preserved. In 2000, the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory was able to develop a DNA profile from that evidence for investigators. This was a major breakthrough. Suddenly, the case contained a biological profile that could potentially identify the perpetrator. But there was an immediate problem. The profile did not match anyone in the available law enforcement databases. The scientific evidence had produced a fingerprint, but there was no name attached to it. Investigators knew that the unknown individual had left biological material behind. They knew that the material was associated with the crime, but they did not know who the person was. This was the kind of problem that could leave a cold case stalled for years. A DNA profile can be extraordinarily powerful when it matches a known suspect. Without a match, however, it can remain simply an unidentified profile. It can sit inside a case file, scientifically precise, but practically silent. Barbaret's case entered that period. The evidence existed. The profile existed. The identity remained unknown. Then forensic science continued to advance. Genetic genealogy began opening new possibilities for investigators working on unidentified perpetrators and victims. Instead of relying only on direct matches, investigators could search for relatives. The method was fundamentally different. The person who left the DNA might never have been arrested. They might never have been in a police database, but a biological relative could have voluntarily contributed genetic information to a genealogy database. That relative could unknowingly become the thread leading investigators toward the suspect. The possibility was extraordinary. A crime committed in 1980 could potentially be solved using technology that did not exist at the time of the murder. Barbaret's case eventually became part of that new era. Detective Aaron Turnage and criminalist Deanna Grossi continued working with the evidence and investigating new forensic options. The case had not been abandoned. It had simply been waiting for an opportunity. Parabon Nanolabs was brought into the investigation for genetic genealogy analysis. The unknown DNA profile was examined for family connections. The goal was to build a genealogical path toward the person whose DNA had been recovered from Barbara. This was not a simple process. Genetic genealogy can identify relatives rather than directly naming a suspect, which means investigators must combine genetic information with genealogical research and traditional detective work. Family relationships must be mapped. Generational connections must be examined. Possibilities must be narrowed. Then investigators must independently verify the resulting lead. Eventually, the work pointed toward Robert Arthur Plimpton. After 40 years of uncertainty, investigators finally had a person to investigate. But they still needed proof. They could not rely solely on a genealogical prediction. They needed a direct DNA comparison. Detectives located Plimpton in Troutdale, Oregon, and began surveillance. They watched him. They waited. They knew that a discarded biological item could provide the confirmation they needed. The opportunity came when Plimpton discarded a piece of chewing gum. Investigators recovered it and sent it for testing. The object was tiny, almost insignificant. But inside that piece of gum was biological material that could potentially settle a question dating back to 1980. The laboratory compared the DNA from the gum with the DNA profile developed from the evidence associated with Barbara Reyes' murder. The result was a match. Suddenly, the investigation had crossed a line that had seemed impossible for decades. The person identified through genetic genealogy was also directly connected through DNA evidence. The name was no longer merely a possibility. It was supported by laboratory analysis. Robert Arthur Plimpton was arrested on June 8, 2021, and charged with Barbara Tucker's murder. The arrest itself became a historic moment for the case. More than 41 years had passed since Barbara Reyes' death. The world had changed completely. Yet the case had finally moved from an unknown perpetrator to an identified defendant. The family now had something they had not had for decades, a person facing criminal charges in connection with Barbara Reyes' death. But even then, the emotional complexity remained. An arrest does not immediately create closure. It creates another waiting period. There would be court proceedings. There would be arguments over evidence. There would be legal challenges. There would be the possibility of a trial. And there would be the unavoidable process of revisiting the murder in public. For people who had spent decades trying to preserve Barbara Reyes' memory, the legal process could bring both hope and pain. Every piece of evidence discussed in court represented a reminder of what had happened to her. Every reference to the night of January 15, 1980 forced the past into the present. Yet the prosecution had a responsibility to establish the case carefully. The DNA evidence was central, but the courtroom would not simply accept a conclusion because the case was old or because the public wanted an answer. The prosecution needed to demonstrate that the evidence met the legal standard for conviction. Plimpton ultimately chose a trial before a judge rather than a jury. The proceedings took place in 2024. The trial lasted approximately 3 weeks. The prosecution presented evidence concerning Barbara Reyes' death and the forensic investigation that ultimately identified Plimpton. The defense challenged aspects of the prosecution's case. The court had to consider evidence accumulated across more than 4 decades. This was not a case built entirely in one period. It was a case built in layers. The original investigators had collected physical evidence in 1980. Scientists developed a DNA profile in 2000. New investigators revisited the case decades later. Genetic genealogy generated a lead. Surveillance produced a discarded object. The laboratory comparison confirmed the genetic connection. Then prosecutors brought all of those pieces into court. The sheer passage of time made the process extraordinary. Most criminal investigations move from crime to arrest to trial within a much shorter period. Barbara Reyes' case moved through 4 different decades before the suspect was identified. The technology used to solve it belonged to an entirely different era than the technology used to investigate it. Yet the central evidence had remained connected across all those years. On March 15th, 2024, Judge Amy Baggio found Robert Arthur Plimpton guilty of first-degree murder and 4 counts of second-degree murder. For Barbara Ray's family, the verdict represented an answer to a question that had been hanging over their lives since 1980. The person responsible had been identified, prosecuted, and convicted. But even the word guilty could not change the reality that Barbara was gone. Justice could not return her 19-year-old life. It could not restore the years her family had spent without her. It could not erase the pain of the crime. What it could do was establish accountability. The legal system had finally determined that Plimpton was responsible for Barbara Ray's murder. The case was no longer an unsolved mystery. It was a conviction, yet sentencing still remained. On October 3, 2024, Plimpton was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years. He was transferred to the Oregon Department of Corrections. The legal conclusion came more than 4 decades after the crime itself. 44 years had passed between Barbara Ray's death and the final conviction. For many people, that number is almost impossible to comprehend. Consider what can happen in 44 years. Children become grandparents. Cities change. Technology transforms daily life. Entire generations grow up knowing only the story of the past. But for Barbara Ray's family, the murder remained personal. The years did not replace her. They simply accumulated around the absence. That is why the solving of a cold case can feel both triumphant and heartbreaking. There is relief because the unknown has become known. There is justice because responsibility has finally been established, but there is also grief because the answer arrives long after the person at the center of the case can no longer benefit from it. Barbara could not see the arrest. She could not hear the verdict. She could not know that the DNA evidence connected to her murder would eventually identify the man responsible. Her family had to carry that knowledge without her. The case also demonstrated why evidence preservation mattered. In 1980, investigators could not have known what future forensic science would be capable of, yet they collected and preserved biological evidence. Decades later, that evidence became the foundation for the DNA profile that ultimately led investigators toward Plimpton. The evidence did not solve the case by itself. It required scientists, detectives, genealogists, laboratories, surveillance, prosecutors, and a court. But without the original evidence, none of those later developments would have mattered. The case had survived because the physical traces of the crime survived. That is, perhaps, the most remarkable aspect of Barbara Tucker Rest's story. The passage of time did not erase every clue. Somewhere inside the evidence, the truth remained. It was hidden, unreadable, and unidentified, but it remained. When forensic science finally advanced enough to unlock it, the case moved with extraordinary speed compared with the decades that had preceded it. A DNA profile became a genealogical lead. A genealogical lead became a suspect. A suspect became a surveillance target. A discarded piece of gum became a direct DNA comparison. The comparison became an arrest. The arrest became a trial. And the trial became a conviction. The entire chain began with a 19-year-old woman whose life was cut short on a January night in Oregon. Her name was Barbara Mae Tucker. For 44 years, her murder was one of Gresham's oldest unanswered questions. Then the evidence finally spoke loudly enough for the world to hear it. The case had not been forgotten. It had been waiting. And sometimes, in a cold case, waiting is the difference between a mystery that lasts forever and a truth that finally emerges. The arrest had ended one kind of uncertainty, but it had opened another. For more than 4 decades, investigators had asked who killed Barbara Tucker. Now they had an answer, but the courtroom demanded something more difficult than an investigative breakthrough. It demanded proof. Robert Arthur Plimpton had been identified through a combination of genetic genealogy, surveillance, and direct DNA comparison. But the prosecution still had to establish his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The murder had occurred in 1980. The trial would take place in 2024. Between those 2 points lay an entire lifetime, and inside that enormous gap were memories that had faded, evidence that had been preserved, investigators who had retired, witnesses who had aged, and a family that had spent decades waiting for justice. When the case finally entered the courtroom, the passage of time itself became part of the story. Barbara had been 19 when she died. The people who remembered her from that period were now more than 40 years old. The college campus had changed. The surrounding community had changed. Technology had changed beyond recognition, but the central question remained exactly the same. Who was responsible for Barbara Tuckerest's death? The prosecution's answer was Robert Arthur Plimpton, and the evidence that brought them to that conclusion was rooted in a chain stretching from the original investigation to modern forensic science. The courtroom would now examine that chain. The prosecution presented the history of the case, beginning with Barbara's final known movements and the discovery of her body. The circumstances surrounding her death were revisited. Witness information from the original investigation was examined. The physical evidence collected after Barbara's death was discussed. Then the story moved forward through time toward the scientific developments that eventually produced a usable DNA profile. This chronology mattered because the prosecution was not presenting a single isolated piece of evidence. It was presenting a sequence of events that had unfolded over more than 4 decades. In 1980, investigators had evidence but no suspect. In 2000, laboratory analysis produced a DNA profile but no match. Years later, genetic genealogy provided a potential identity. Investigators then obtained DNA from Plimpton through discarded chewing gum. The laboratory comparison connected the new sample to the old profile. Each stage reinforced the next. The prosecution's case depended on the court understanding that progression. The defense, meanwhile, had the responsibility of challenging the prosecution's interpretation and testing whether the evidence truly established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That is one of the fundamental features of a criminal trial. An arrest is not a conviction. A DNA lead is not automatically proof of murder. A suspect can be identified and still be found not guilty if the prosecution cannot establish the necessary elements of the crime. The courtroom therefore became the place where the scientific evidence would meet the legal standard. The DNA evidence was among the most significant aspects of the case. Modern DNA analysis can be extraordinarily powerful, but its significance depends on how the sample was collected, preserved, analyzed, and interpreted. In Barbara's case, the biological material had been collected during the original investigation and preserved for decades. Scientists later developed a DNA profile from vaginal swabs collected during Barbara's autopsy. That profile did not initially identify anyone, but it remained available for future investigation. This was crucial because scientific capabilities continued to evolve. A sample that could only establish an unidentified profile in 2000 could eventually become the foundation of a genetic genealogy investigation. The case demonstrated how forensic evidence can gain new value as technology advances. The evidence itself had not necessarily changed. The tools used to examine it had. By the time investigators began exploring genetic genealogy, they could use the old DNA profile in a completely different way. Instead of waiting for an exact match in a law enforcement database, they could search for biological relatives and construct a family connection. The genealogy investigation eventually pointed toward Robert Arthur Plimpton, but investigators did not stop there. They knew that a genealogical lead had to be independently confirmed. That was why the surveillance operation mattered. Detectives located Plimpton and watched him until they obtained discarded chewing gum. The gum provided a new DNA sample. The laboratory comparison then gave investigators the direct connection they needed. In the courtroom, the significance of that process was clear. The identification had not depended solely on a family tree hypothesis. The DNA from Plimpton's discarded gum matched the DNA profile from evidence connected to Barbara's murder. The scientific evidence, therefore, became a central component of the prosecution's case. But the trial was about more than laboratory results. The court also had to consider the broader circumstances of Barbara's death. The original investigation had established that she had been sexually assaulted and beaten before her body was discovered in a wooded area near Mount Hood Community College. Witnesses had reported seeing a young woman in apparent distress near Northeast Kane Drive and a man emerging from nearby bushes and leading her back toward the campus. Those details had been part of the investigation since 1980. More than 40 years later, they were being examined again. The trial therefore required the court to move backward through time. It had to reconstruct a night that had occurred before modern forensic genealogy, before smartphones, before the widespread use of digital surveillance, and before many of the technological tools now considered essential to criminal investigation. The prosecution had to demonstrate how the evidence connected Plimpton to Barbara and to the crime itself. The defense had the opportunity to challenge the evidence and raise questions about the prosecution's conclusion. The court had to evaluate everything carefully. For Barbara's family, hearing the details again could not have been easy. Cold case trials are unique because the pain of the original crime is mixed with the long memory of decades. A family may have spent years learning to live without answers, only to have the case suddenly become active again. Detectives arrive, prosecutors call. Lawyers ask questions. Old photographs and evidence return to public attention. The victim's name appears in headlines once again. The past becomes present. But the family also has something that was missing for decades: a defendant. Someone is finally being held legally responsible for the crime. That can bring a complicated combination of relief, grief, anger, and exhaustion. Barbara's case had reached that point. The trial was not merely a legal proceeding, it was the culmination of 44 years of investigation. Every piece of evidence presented represented another step in a journey that had begun when Barbara's body was discovered in 1980. Detective Aaron Turnaga's involvement in the case had begun years before the arrest. In 2015, criminalist Deanna Grossi had continued working with the physical evidence and researching forensic possibilities. Their work was part of the larger effort to revisit an old homicide with modern investigative tools. Without that persistence, the DNA profile might have remained an unidentified piece of evidence. The case might have remained unsolved, but the investigation continued until genetic genealogy created a new path. That path eventually led to Plimpton. The surveillance operation then transformed a genealogical lead into a direct forensic comparison. And now the courtroom had to decide what all of it meant. The trial lasted approximately 3 weeks. The prosecution was represented by Chief Deputy District Attorney Kirsten Snowden and Senior Deputy District Attorney Todd Jackson. The defense challenged the state's case as the proceedings unfolded. Judge Amy Boggio presided over the trial. Rather than being decided by a jury, the case was tried before the judge. That meant Judge Boggio would ultimately evaluate the evidence and determine whether the prosecution had met the burden of proof. The responsibility was enormous. A conviction in a murder case is one of the most serious judgments a court can make. The fact that the case had remained unresolved for decades could not substitute for evidence. Public attention could not substitute for evidence. The suffering of Barbara's family could not substitute for evidence. The court had to reach its decision based on what was presented in the proceeding, and as the evidence was laid out, the story of the DNA became increasingly central. A biological profile developed from Barbara's case in 2000. No conventional database match. Years of investigation, genetic genealogy, a lead pointing toward Plimpton, surveillance, chewing gum, laboratory testing, a direct DNA match. It was a chain that crossed generations of forensic science. The prosecution argued that the chain demonstrated Plimpton's connection to Barbara. The defense had the opportunity to challenge that interpretation, but the scientific evidence remained a powerful part of the case. There was another element that made the proceedings especially striking. The evidence had not been created for the purpose of solving a future cold case. The vaginal swabs had been collected during Barbara's original autopsy because investigators were examining the circumstances of her death. Nobody knew in 1980 that the evidence might still matter decades later. Nobody knew that genetic genealogy would eventually become available. Nobody knew that investigators would one day use a piece of chewing gum to confirm the identity of the person connected to the old DNA profile. The evidence simply survived. That survival became the foundation for everything that followed. The courtroom therefore represented the meeting point of two eras. 1980 stood on one side, 2024 stood on the other. Barbara's murder had crossed that enormous distance through evidence, and now, after decades of uncertainty, the judge would have to determine whether the evidence had finally established the truth. The trial moved toward its conclusion. The prosecution had presented its case. The defense had challenged it. The evidence had been examined. The arguments had been made, and Barbaret's family waited for the verdict. After 44 years, the question that had haunted them since the winter of 1980 was finally about to receive a legal answer. The evidence had already produced a name. Now the court would decide whether that name belonged to the person responsible for Barbara Tucker's murder. The courtroom had heard the evidence. The DNA had been examined. The history of the investigation had been reconstructed. More than 4 decades after Barbara Tucker's death, the case had reached the moment that investigators, prosecutors, and Barbaret's family had waited for since 1980. There was no longer an unknown profile without a name. There was no longer a cold case without a suspect. Robert Arthur Plimpton was sitting before the court, and the judge now had to determine whether the prosecution had proved that he was responsible for Barbaret's murder. The burden was enormous because the passage of time could not be ignored. The crime had happened 44 years earlier. The courtroom was being asked to judge events from another era using evidence that had survived across generations. Memories had faded. Circumstances had changed, but the DNA evidence remained at the center of the prosecution's case. It represented a scientific connection between evidence recovered after Barbaret's death and a biological sample obtained from Plimpton decades later. The prosecution had presented the path that led investigators from the original crime seen to the eventual identification. Barbara had been 19 when she was killed. Her body had been discovered in a wooded area between Kane Road and a school parking lot near Mount Hood Community College. Investigators had collected evidence. Years later, that evidence produced a DNA profile. The profile did not initially match anyone in available law enforcement databases. For years, the unknown contributor remained unidentified. Then, modern genetic genealogy offered investigators a new method of searching for the person behind the profile. The genealogical investigation produced a lead pointing toward Plimpton. Detectives located him and conducted surveillance. A discarded piece of chewing gum provided biological material. Laboratory testing established that the DNA from the gum matched the DNA profile associated with Barbaret's case. The chain was now complete enough for prosecutors to present it in court, but the judge still had to determine whether that chain proved murder beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense challenged the prosecution's case as it had every legal right to do. A courtroom is not designed simply to confirm what investigators believe. It is designed to test those conclusions. Evidence must survive scrutiny. Witness accounts must be evaluated. Scientific conclusions must be considered carefully. The judge must distinguish between what is known, what is inferred, and what the evidence actually proves. That process can be especially demanding in a cold case because the passage of time creates uncertainty. A witness may remember an event differently after decades. Documents may be incomplete. Investigators who worked the original case may no longer be available. But Barbaret's case had one advantage that many cold cases lack. The physical evidence had survived. The biological evidence collected in 1980 remained available for modern testing. That meant investigators did not have to depend entirely on memories from the past. They had scientific evidence that could be examined using 21st century methods. The courtroom, therefore, became a meeting point between old evidence and modern technology. The prosecution explained how the DNA profile had been developed from Barbaret's evidence. The genetic genealogy investigation was discussed as the method that led investigators toward Plimpton. Then the direct DNA comparison provided the confirmation. Each stage of the investigation had a different purpose. Genetic genealogy generated the lead. The discarded gum provided the direct sample. Laboratory analysis established the match. Together, the evidence formed the backbone of the identification. The case also demonstrated how a cold case can remain alive even when there are no obvious new leads. The evidence does not necessarily become stronger with age. Instead, the tools used to examine it become more powerful. In 1980, detectives could preserve biological material without knowing exactly how useful it might someday become. In 2000, scientists could develop a DNA profile but could not find a matching identity in the databases available. Years later, genetic genealogy created a new investigative pathway. The evidence had not changed. The scientific world had. That difference ultimately became decisive. As the trial approached its conclusion, the emotional weight of the case became impossible to separate from the legal process. Barbara was still 19 in the photographs presented to the public. She had never reached adulthood beyond the age of 19. She had never experienced the decades that followed her death. Her family had. They had grown older. They had lived through the passage of time while carrying the memory of a daughter, sister, or loved one whose future had been violently taken away. The trial could not give that future back. It could only establish responsibility. That distinction is at the heart of every long-delayed murder case. A conviction does not undo the past. It does not restore a victim. It does not erase grief. But it can answer the central question that has haunted a family for decades. Who was responsible? And after 44 years, the answer was about to be delivered. On March 15, 2024, Judge Amy Baggio issued her verdict. Robert Arthur Plimpton was found guilty of first-degree murder and 4 counts of second-degree murder in connection with Barbara Tucker West's death. The decision brought the legal investigation to its most significant turning point. The case that had begun in 1980 as an unidentified murder was now a conviction. The name that had once been hidden behind an unknown DNA profile had been spoken in a courtroom as the name of the man found responsible. For investigators, the verdict validated years of work. For Barbara's family, it represented a moment that had once seemed almost impossible to imagine. The person responsible for Barbara's death had finally been held accountable. Yet the verdict also carried the weight of everything that had happened before it. 44 years of waiting, 44 years of unanswered questions, 44 years of anniversaries without justice. The word guilty could not erase any of that. It could not return Barbara. It could not restore the years her family had spent wondering whether the case would ever be solved, but it could establish a permanent legal record of responsibility. The case was no longer open. The investigation had finally reached a conclusion in court. The verdict also demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence in unsolved cases. If the biological material collected in 1980 had not survived, the modern investigation might never have been possible. If scientists had not developed a DNA profile in 2000, there might have been nothing to search. If investigators had not revisited the case decades later, the genetic genealogy opportunity might have been missed. If detectives had not followed the genealogical lead with traditional surveillance, they might not have obtained the direct DNA confirmation. The conviction was therefore the product of multiple generations of work. No single investigator solved the case alone. The original detectives created the foundation. The forensic scientists preserved and analyzed the evidence. Later investigators reopened the file. Genetic genealogists identified a possible family connection. Detectives confirmed the lead. Laboratory scientists compared the DNA. Prosecutors presented the evidence, and the court reached the final legal determination. It was a chain stretching across 44 years. The story of Barbara Tucker West's murder therefore became more than a story about a suspect finally being identified. It became a demonstration of how a cold case can move when evidence survives long enough for new technology to find meaning inside it. The unknown DNA profile had once represented frustration. It was proof that someone had left biological evidence behind, but it offered no identity. Decades later, that same profile became the key to identifying Plimpton. The evidence had been waiting silently while the science evolved around it, and once investigators learned how to use it, the mystery began to unravel. Yet the legal process did not end with the verdict. Sentencing still remained. The court would have to determine the punishment. For the family, that meant another appearance, another legal proceeding, another opportunity to hear Barbara's name connected to the case. The final sentence would come months later. Until then, the conviction itself represented a profound shift. For 44 years, Barbara's murder had belonged to the category of cases with no known offender. Now it belonged to a different category, a solved homicide with a conviction. The difference was enormous. It meant that the investigation had succeeded where decades of conventional methods had failed. It meant that the DNA evidence had ultimately spoken clearly enough to identify the man connected to Barbara S., and it meant that the case would no longer be defined by the question of whether Barbara's killer would ever be found. That question had been answered. But another question remained. What does justice look like when it arrives 44 years late? There is no simple answer. For some families, a conviction brings relief. For others, it brings complicated emotions because the trial forces them to relive the crime. Sometimes the long-awaited answer creates new questions rather than eliminating every uncertainty. And sometimes the most painful realization is that no verdict can restore the life that was lost. Barbara Tucker was 19 years old when she died. She never saw the world that would emerge over the next 4 decades. She never saw the technology that would eventually identify the person connected to her murder. She never knew that investigators would one day use genetic genealogy to follow her killeress family tree. She never knew that a discarded piece of chewing gum would become a critical piece of evidence. She never knew that a judge would eventually pronounce a guilty verdict. But the evidence remained connected to her. The DNA profile developed from the evidence collected after her death became a thread running through the decade. That thread was eventually followed all the way to Robert Arthur Plimpton. And once the court accepted the evidence and returned the guilty verdict, the 44-year mystery finally had a legal conclusion. Still, the story could not simply end with the word guilty. There was a final stage waiting. The sentence would determine how many years Plimpton would spend in prison. Barbara Ray's family had already waited more than 4 decades for justice. Now they would have to wait a little longer for the final punishment. The courtroom had answered the question of responsibility. The next question was what the law would do with that responsibility. On October 3rd, 2024, that final stage would arrive. Robert Arthur Plimpton would return to court to learn his sentence, and after 44 years of silence, the case of Barbara Tucker was moving toward its final legal chapter. By the time Robert Arthur Plimpton returned to court in October 2024, the murder of Barbara Tucker was no longer an unsolved mystery. The question of identity had been answered. The question of guilt had been answered. What remained was punishment. More than 4 decades had passed since Barbara was found dead near Mount Hood Community College, and the legal system was now preparing to determine what consequence Plimpton would face for a crime committed in 1980. For Barbara Ray's family, the sentencing hearing represented another milestone in a journey that had begun with shock, grief, and unanswered questions. The case had already taken them through an investigation that seemed to disappear into history through decades of waiting, through a remarkable forensic breakthrough, through an arrest, and finally through a trial. Now the court would determine the sentence. On October 3rd, 2024, Plimpton was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years to be served. He was transferred to the custody of the Oregon Department of Correction. The sentence brought the formal legal process to its conclusion. A case that had begun more than 44 years earlier now had an identified offender, a conviction, and a prison sentence. But the emotional conclusion was far more complicated. The law could determine punishment. It could establish accountability. It could create a permanent record stating that Plimpton was responsible for Barbara Ray's murder. But the law could not return Barbara to her family. It could not restore the 19-year-old life that had been taken in January 1980. It could not recover the birthdays, holidays, conversations, achievements, relationships, and ordinary moments that Barbara never lived. That is the contradiction at the heart of every long unsolved murder. The final answer can arrive. But it arrives after the victim has been gone for years. Sometimes generations. Barbara remained 19 forever. Her killer grew older. The investigators changed. The technology changed. The world changed. But Barbara Ray's photograph never changed. Her family carried the memory of the young woman she had been while time continued moving forward. The sentence, therefore, represented justice in a legal sense, but it could never represent restoration. There was nothing that could restore what had been lost. What it could do was draw a line under the legal uncertainty. For decades, the case had contained an unknown killer. Now there was a conviction and a sentence. The question of whether anyone would ever be held accountable had finally been answered. The path to that moment was extraordinary. The original investigators had collected biological evidence after Barbara Ray's murder in 1980. At the time, they could not have known that the evidence would remain useful more than 4 decades later. The material was preserved. In 2000, the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory successfully developed a DNA profile from vaginal swabs collected during Barbara Ray's autopsy. That profile represented a major scientific breakthrough, but it did not immediately identify the perpetrator. There was no conventional database match. The DNA had a profile but no name. That would remain the central problem for years. Eventually, modern genetic genealogy created a new possibility. Instead of looking only for an exact match, investigators could search for relatives and use those relationships to construct a genealogical path toward the unknown person. The investigation eventually pointed toward Robert Arthur Plimpton, but detectives did not stop with the genealogy. They conducted surveillance and obtained discarded chewing gum from Plimpton. The gum contained DNA. Laboratory analysis showed that the DNA matched the profile from Barbara Ray's case. That result transformed the investigation. A genealogical lead became a direct scientific connection. The suspect was identified. The arrest followed in June 2021. The trial followed years later. The conviction came in March 2024, and the sentence arrived in October. The timeline itself is almost impossible to absorb. Barbara was killed in 1980. The DNA profile was developed in 2000. A genetic genealogy lead emerged decades later. Plimpton was arrested in 2021. He was convicted in 2024. The entire process stretched across a period longer than the childhood, adulthood, and middle age of an entire generation. Yet the evidence traveled through all of it. This is why the Barbara Tucker case became such a powerful example of the potential of forensic genealogy. The breakthrough was not based on a brand new piece of evidence discovered at the crime scene. It came from evidence that had been there for decades. The biological material had already been collected. The DNA had already been extracted. What changed was the technology and the investigative method. The case demonstrates how cold case investigations can sometimes be transformed when old evidence is examined through new scientific techniques. But technology alone is never enough. Someone has to reopen the file. Someone has to decide that an old case deserves another look. Someone has to research the evidence. Someone has to follow the lady. Someone has to obtain the confirmation. In Barbara Ray's case, those responsibilities were carried by investigators across different eras. Detective Aaron Turnage became involved in the case in 2015. Criminalist Deanna Grossi worked with the physical evidence and explored advances in forensic technology. Genetic genealogy researchers examined the DNA profile. Detectives conducted surveillance. Laboratory scientists performed the comparison. Prosecutors brought the evidence into court, and the judge ultimately determined that the prosecution had proved its case. The sentence was therefore the final link in a chain that had been built over decades. It also marked the end of one of Gresham's oldest murder investigations. For the community, the case had been a reminder that an unsolved crime does not necessarily disappear. Barbara Ray's murder had remained part of the city's history. People who had never known her personally could still encounter the story through news reports and police records. For those who had known Barbara, however, the case was never simply history. It was personal. The conviction could not erase the pain, but it could change the nature of the memory. Instead of remembering Barbara as the victim of a murder with no identified perpetrator, her family could now know that the person responsible had been found and convicted. There is a difference between uncertainty and painful certainty. Before the arrest, the family had to live with the possibility that the killer might never be identified. After the conviction, they no longer had to wonder who was responsible. The answer was established in court. That distinction matters enormously in cold cases. An unresolved murder can create a permanent sense of unfinished business. Every new unidentified body, every arrest in another case, every news story about forensic breakthroughs can reopen the question. Families can spend years wondering whether their loved one's case will ever receive the same attention. When a case is solved, some of that uncertainty disappears. The grief remains, but the unanswered question no longer dominates everything. Barbara Ray's story also illustrates the strange relationship between time and evidence. Human beings remember imperfectly. Physical evidence can sometimes remain remarkably stable. A witness may forget a face. A neighborhood may change. A building may be demolished, but a preserved biological sample can remain capable of revealing information decades later. That is exactly what happened here. The evidence did not know that it would become important. It simply survived. Then science caught up with it. The chewing gum was equally ordinary. There was nothing remarkable about it until investigators recognized what it could contain. A discarded object became a source of DNA. That DNA became confirmation. Confirmation became an arrest. The arrest became a trial. The trial became a conviction, and the conviction became a life sentence. The sequence is extraordinary because each step depended on the previous one. Without the original evidence, there would have been no DNA profile. Without the DNA profile, there would have been no genetic genealogy lead. Without the genealogical lead, investigators might not have focused on Plimpton. Without the surveillance operation, they might not have obtained the direct DNA sample. Without the laboratory comparison, the identity might not have been confirmed. Without the confirmation, there would have been no prosecution based on that evidence. And without the trial, there would have been no conviction. Cold cases are often portrayed as mysteries solved by one dramatic clue. Barbara Reyes' case shows something different. It was solved through persistence. The breakthrough may have appeared sudden in the news, but the work behind it was anything but sudden. It stretched across decades. It involved investigators who refused to let the evidence disappear. It involved scientists who developed techniques that did not exist when Barbara died. It involved detectives who were willing to revisit an old case instead of accepting that its answer was beyond reach. And it involved a family that had waited for justice for most of a lifetime. When Plimpton received a life sentence with a minimum of 40 years, the legal system had imposed a punishment that extended far into the future. But for Barbara Ray's family, the most important fact was not the number of years. It was the fact that the case had finally reached a conclusion. The killer had been identified. The court had found him guilty. The sentence had been imposed. Barbara Ray's name was no longer attached to an unanswered murder. Her story had a legal ending, yet there was still something haunting about the timeline. Barbara died in 1980. 44 years later, the person responsible was finally sentenced. That means an entire generation grew up while her murder remained unsolved. Children were born after her death and became adults before the killer was identified. Technology advanced from an era before widespread personal computers to an era of genetic databases and forensic genealogy. And throughout all those changes, the evidence connected to Barbara remained quietly preserved. The sentence could not change history, but it could confirm something that had been uncertain for most of Barbara Ray's family's lives. The truth had not disappeared. It had simply taken decades to uncover. The case of Barbara Tucker therefore ends not with a dramatic chase or a sudden confession, but with something far more powerful and unsettling. A scientific trail that began with biological evidence collected in 1980 eventually led investigators to a living man more than 40 years later. The court then transformed that evidence into a conviction and a sentence. Barbara Reyes' killer could no longer hide behind time. Time had not erased the evidence. It had carried the evidence forward until investigators finally knew how to use it. And after 44 years, the question that had haunted Barbara Ray's family had finally been answered. Long after the headlines faded, long after the original investigators had left the case, long after the world Barbara Tucker knew had changed beyond recognition, one thing remained exactly where it had been left decades earlier: the evidence. It had no voice. It could not explain what happened. It could not name a suspect, but it survived. And that survival became the quiet force behind a murder investigation that would eventually stretch across 44 years. When Barbara was killed in 1980, forensic science was nowhere near the level it would reach in the decades that followed. Investigators could collect biological material, preserve samples, photograph a crime scene, record witness statements, and document injuries, but the ability to extract and interpret DNA was still developing. The evidence collected from Barbara could therefore contain information that investigators could not yet use. Nobody at the time could know that the material preserved from the investigation would eventually become the foundation of a genetic profile. Nobody could know that a future generation of detectives would return to the case and ask whether modern science could reveal what earlier investigators could not. Yet that is precisely what happened. The biological evidence associated with Barbara's murder remained preserved. In 2000, the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory examined vaginal swabs collected during Barbara's autopsy and successfully developed a DNA profile. The breakthrough was significant. After 20 years, investigators finally had a scientific profile that could potentially identify the person whose biological material had been recovered. But the discovery created another problem. The profile did not match anyone in the available databases. There was a DNA profile, but there was no name. The evidence had become more powerful without becoming more informative in the way investigators desperately needed. The unknown contributor remained unknown. For a family waiting since 1980, that kind of development could be both hopeful and devastating. Science had proven that the evidence was usable, but it had not yet answered the central question: who was the person behind the DNA? The case continued to wait. Years passed. The DNA profile remained available. Then the world of forensic investigation began changing again. Genetic genealogy introduced an entirely different approach to unidentified DNA. Instead of asking whether an unknown profile matched someone already known to law enforcement, investigators could search for biological relatives. This was a fundamental shift. The person who left the DNA might never have been arrested. They might never have been fingerprinted. They might never have entered a criminal database. But somewhere in their extended family, someone might have shared enough genetic information to create a connection. That connection could become the first branch of a much larger family tree. Investigators could then use traditional genealogy research to trace relationships, identify possible family members, and narrow the possibilities. It was painstaking work. It required scientific expertise and investigative discipline. A distant relative could produce dozens or even hundreds of possible paths. Investigators had to determine which relationships made sense, which individuals fit the known circumstances, and which possibilities could be eliminated. The process could not replace traditional police investigation. It had to work alongside it. Barbara's case eventually entered this new forensic era. Investigators, including Detective Aaron Turnage and criminalist Deanna Grossi, continued examining the case and considering modern methods. The evidence was no longer being viewed only as a historical record. It was being viewed as a potential source of new information. Parabon Nanolabs was involved in the genetic genealogy analysis. The unknown DNA profile was examined for potential familial connections. Somewhere inside the genetic information was a path. Eventually, that path led investigators toward Robert Arthur Plimpton. The discovery was remarkable, but it was also only the beginning. Investigators could not take a genealogical prediction into court and simply declare that the mystery was solved. They needed direct confirmation. The investigation, therefore, shifted from genealogy to surveillance. Detectives located Plimpton and began observing him. The objective was clear. They needed to obtain a biological sample from him without alerting him to the investigation. The opportunity came through something almost unbelievably ordinary. Plimpton discarded a piece of chewing gum. Investigators recovered it. The gum was sent to the laboratory for DNA analysis. The object itself was insignificant in appearance. It had no obvious connection to a murder that had occurred 41 years earlier, but it contained biological material. That material could answer the question the genealogy investigation had raised. When the laboratory compared the DNA from the chewing gum with the DNA profile developed from evidence connected to Barbara's murder, the profiles matched. The result was a direct scientific connection. The man investigators had reached through genetic genealogy was the same man whose DNA matched the profile recovered from Barbara's case. The unknown had become known. The name Robert Arthur Plimpton was no longer simply a possibility. The laboratory evidence provided the confirmation investigators needed. The arrest followed on June 8, 2021. More than 4 decades after Barbara's death, detectives finally had a defendant. The news was extraordinary because the case had remained unsolved for so long that many people could have assumed the answer would never be found. But cold cases often contain a strange contradiction. They can look inactive while remaining full of potential. A case file may not change for years, but a new technology can transform the meaning of evidence that has been sitting inside it all along. Barbara's case was a perfect example. The biological material was old. The DNA profile was old, but the investigative method was new, and the combination produced a result that investigators in 1980 could never have imagined. The arrest also demonstrated the importance of confirmation. Genetic genealogy had pointed investigators toward Plimpton, but the direct DNA comparison provided the crucial link. It was not enough to identify someone who appeared genetically related to the unknown contributor. Investigators needed evidence connecting the person directly to the biological profile. The chewing gum provided that opportunity. The laboratory comparison then transformed suspicion into scientific evidence. That evidence would eventually be presented in court. The legal process would examine the scientific findings, the investigation, and the circumstances surrounding Barbaret's death. The case had moved from the quiet world of cold case files into the public world of prosecution. The passage of time made the process unusual. The original murder investigation had taken place in 1980. The suspect had been identified in 2021. The trial would take place in 2024. Different generations had handled different stages of the case. The people involved in the original investigation were not necessarily the same people who developed the DNA profile, pursued genetic genealogy, or conducted surveillance. Yet the evidence connected all of them. It was almost as if the case had been passed from one generation to another, with each investigator carrying one part of the unanswered question. The original detectives collected and preserved the biological material. Scientists later extracted the DNA profile. New investigators revisited the file. Genetic genealogy created a path toward a suspect. Detectives confirmed the path through surveillance and DNA. Prosecutors then brought the evidence before a judge. The case moved forward because the evidence had been preserved long enough for each new generation to contribute something the previous generation could not. This is one of the most important lessons of cold case investigations. Evidence does not always become obsolete simply because it becomes old. In some circumstances, old evidence becomes more valuable as science improves. A biological sample that could not identify anyone decades ago may become decisive after advances in DNA analysis. A witness statement that once seemed ambiguous may gain significance when combined with new forensic information. A location that once offered few clues may become important when investigators can reinterpret old evidence with modern technology. Time does not guarantee a solution, but it does not necessarily prevent one either. Barbaret's case survived because the physical evidence survived. The DNA profile became the thread connecting 1980 to 2021. The chewing gum became the bridge connecting the suspect to that profile, and the arrest became the bridge connecting the investigation to the courtroom. But there was another reason the evidence mattered. It gave investigators something objective to work with when human memory had become increasingly unreliable. 40 years can change a person's recollection. Witnesses can forget details. They can remember events differently. They can lose confidence in what they once knew. Physical evidence, however, can preserve a record of what was present at the time of the crime. DNA cannot tell investigators everything about an event. It cannot describe every movement or explain every decision, but it can establish a biological connection with extraordinary precision. In Barbaret's case, that connection became the foundation of the prosecution. The scientific trail also demonstrated the importance of patience. The investigators who worked on the case in later decades did not know when the breakthrough would come. There was no guarantee genetic genealogy would produce a useful relative. There was no guarantee the genealogical lead would point toward the correct individual. There was no guarantee investigators would obtain a usable sample from the suspect. Every stage contained uncertainty. Yet they continued. That persistence eventually produced the result that had seemed impossible for so long. By the time Plimpton stood trial in 2024, the case had become a remarkable example of how modern forensic technology can reopen a historical investigation. The court would eventually find him guilty of first-degree murder and for counts of second-degree murder. Later, he would receive a life sentence with a minimum of 40 years. The legal outcome brought the case to a formal conclusion, but the evidence itself tells a story that is just as powerful as the verdict. It tells the story of information waiting patiently inside material that investigators had preserved decades earlier. It tells the story of science moving forward while an old case remained unresolved. It tells the story of investigators who returned to evidence that had once seemed incapable of providing an identity. And it tells the story of a 19-year-old woman whose murder remained connected to a biological trace long after the world around her had changed. The most unsettling detail is perhaps how ordinary the final confirmation was: a piece of chewing gum, something discarded without a second thought, something that could have disappeared unnoticed. But investigators saw its potential. They recovered it. The laboratory examined it. And inside that tiny object was the genetic information that helped confirm the identity of the man connected to Barbara Ray's murder. That is the strange power of forensic evidence. What looks meaningless to one person can become decisive to another. What appears to be waste can become a key. What seems too small to matter can survive long enough to change the course of an entire investigation. Barbara Ray's case had been silent for decades. The original evidence had been silent too, but silence did not mean absence. The clues were still there. They were waiting for the right question, the right technology, and the right investigators. When those finally came together, the 44-year mystery began to collapse. The evidence had survived. The science had caught up, and Barbara Tucker's killer could no longer remain hidden behind the passage of time. Before there was DNA, before there was genetic genealogy, before a discarded piece of chewing gum could connect a man to a murder committed more than 40 years earlier, there were witnesses, people who saw fragments of Barbara Tucker's final hours, people who may not have understood the importance of what they were seeing, people who could not have known that a brief observation on a January evening in 1980 would eventually become part of a case that lasted for decades. Their memories became part of the original investigation, and their observations helped investigators reconstruct the frightening sequence surrounding Barbara Ray's disappearance. But memories are fragile. A witness can remember a face without remembering exactly when it appeared. A person can remember an unusual movement but not understand why it mattered. A moment that seems ordinary when it happens can become significant only after a crime is discovered. That was the situation surrounding Barbara Ray's final known movement. On January 15, 1980, Barbara was near Mount Hood Community College in Gresham, Oregon. She was 19 years old, a student with an ordinary future ahead of her. Nothing about that evening suggested that she would become the victim of a murder that would remain unsolved for more than 4 decades. Then witnesses saw something unusual near Northeast Kane Drive. A young woman appeared to be in distress. She was reportedly waving toward passing vehicles. The scene was brief, but it was disturbing. Why was she trying to attract attention? Was she asking someone to stop? Was she trying to escape from someone? Was she simply reacting to something happening nearby? At that moment, the people who saw her could not know the answers. Then another figure entered the scene. Witnesses reported seeing a man emerge from nearby bushes and led the woman back toward the college. The image was simple but deeply unsettling. A woman appearing to need help, a man approaching from a concealed area, the two moving away from the road. Then the witnesses lost sight of them. That was one of the last known moments in Barbara Ray's life. The next morning, the story had changed completely. Barbara Ray's body was discovered in a wooded area between Kane Road and a school parking lot. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten. The discovery transformed the earlier witness observations into potential evidence. The woman waving toward traffic was no longer an isolated sight. The man emerging from the bushes was no longer merely an unidentified stranger. Every detail suddenly mattered. Investigators needed to know exactly what the witnesses had seen. They needed descriptions. They needed timelines. They needed to understand where Barbara had been standing, where the man had appeared, and where they had gone. But reconstructing a crime through witness memory is difficult even when only a few hours have passed. In Barbara Ray's case, the challenge would eventually become much greater because decades would pass before the identity of the killer was confirmed. The original investigation, therefore, depended on information that was necessarily incomplete. Witnesses could provide observations, but they could not provide the kind of scientific certainty that DNA would eventually offer. Their accounts could help establish the circumstances surrounding Barbara Ray's disappearance, but they could not produce the killer's name. This was one reason the case became so difficult. Investigators had a victim. They had a crime scene. They had witnesses. They had physical evidence. But none of those pieces immediately connected to a known suspect. The man seen near Barbara remained unidentified, and as the years passed, the original witness accounts became part of the historical record of the case. The importance of those observations cannot be underestimated. In a homicide investigation, even a brief sighting can establish a timeline. It can show that the victim was alive at a particular time. It can identify the last known location. It can establish that another person was present. It can help investigators understand whether a victim appeared frightened, injured, or otherwise distressed. In Barbara Ray's case, the reported sighting near Kane Drive became part of the reconstruction of her final moments. Yet there was an unavoidable limitation. The witnesses did not know they were watching a murder unfold. They did not know that the woman would be found dead the next morning. They did not know that the man they saw would eventually become the subject of a 44-year investigation. The meaning of the moment only became clear after Barbara Ray's body was discovered. That is one of the most haunting aspects of witness evidence. People often realize the importance of what they saw only after something terrible has happened. A person may remember a strange vehicle, an unfamiliar face, a brief argument, or someone acting unusually. At the time, there may be no reason to stop and memorize the details. After a murder, however, those ordinary observations can become critical. Investigators must then ask witnesses to reconstruct the moment. What did you see? Where were you standing? What time was it? What direction did they go? What did the person look like? What was Barbara wearing? Did she say anything? Did the man say anything? Was she resisting? Was she trying to attract attention? Each question mattered, but human memory does not operate like a recording device. It changes with time. New information can influence old memories. Repeated interviews can reinforce some details while others fade. This is why physical evidence became so important in Barbara Ray's case. The witness accounts helped establish the story, but the DNA eventually provided a scientific connection that memories could not. Decades later, investigators could revisit the physical evidence without depending entirely on recollections from 1980. The DNA profile developed from Barbara Ray's autopsy evidence gave them something objective. It could be compared. It could be tested. It could eventually be connected to a suspect. That did not make the witnesses unimportant. Their observations remained part of the original reconstruction, but the scientific evidence provided a different kind of certainty. The contrast between the witnesses and the DNA illustrates how murder investigations evolve. The first investigators work with what they have. They follow leads. They interview people. They examine the crime scene. They collect evidence. If those efforts fail, the case becomes cold. Later investigators inherit the same material but may have access to technologies that did not exist before. They can ask new questions. They can perform tests that earlier detectives could never have imagined. Barbara Ray's case was exactly that kind of investigation. The original witnesses could only describe what they saw. Decades later, genetic genealogy could trace relationships hidden inside DNA. Detectives could then conduct surveillance and obtain a new sample from a suspect. The final confirmation came from science rather than memory, but the original witness observations still mattered because they established the frightening beginning of Barbara Ray's final journey. A woman was seen seeking attention near the road. A man appeared from nearby bushes. The woman was led away. The next morning, Barbara was dead. Those details created the outline of the mystery. For decades, investigators did not know who the man was. The uncertainty surrounding him became one of the central questions of the case. Was he a stranger? Someone Barbara knew? Someone who happened to be nearby? Was the sighting connected directly to the murder? The investigation could not answer those questions immediately. The man remained unidentified. That uncertainty is what made the case so haunting. The witnesses had seen something, but what they had seen was only a fragment. There was no complete picture, and without a suspect, investigators could not easily determine how the fragment fit into the larger story. The case therefore remained open while time continued to pass. Barbara Ray's family waited. Investigators changed. Technology advanced. The witnesses grew older. Memories inevitably became more distant. Yet the evidence remained. The DNA profile developed in 2000 would eventually become the most important investigative tool. When genetic genealogy later pointed toward Robert Arthur Plimpton, detectives still needed direct confirmation. The chewing gum provided it. The laboratory comparison established that Plimpton's DNA matched the profile associated with Barbaret's case. The arrest followed. The trial followed years later, and in March 2024, Judge Amy Baggio found Plimpton guilty of first-degree murder and 4 counts of second-degree murder. The verdict finally gave legal meaning to the fragments that investigators had been carrying since 1980. The witnesses had seen Barbara, investigators had found Barbara, scientists had recovered biological evidence. Modern forensic methods had identified the man connected to that evidence, and the court had ultimately found him guilty. Yet the witness accounts remain haunting because they represent how close people may have been to understanding the danger Barbara faced. Someone saw her. Someone saw the man, but nobody knew what was happening until it was too late. That is the cruel nature of hindsight. After the crime, every detail seems obvious. Before the crime, nothing is obvious. A young woman waving near a road can look like someone having an ordinary problem. A man walking with her can look like a stranger helping her. A brief encounter can seem insignificant. Only later does the full meaning emerge. Barbaret's final hours therefore remain one of the most emotionally powerful parts of the case. The witnesses were not investigators. They were ordinary people witnessing an extraordinary tragedy without knowing it. They could not stop the crime because they did not know a crime was taking place. Their observations became part of the investigation only after Barbara was found dead. And even then, they could not identify the killer with certainty. The answer would eventually come from somewhere the witnesses could never have imagined. It would come from microscopic biological evidence preserved from Barbaret's body. It would come from DNA technology that did not exist when she was killed. It would come from genetic genealogy and a family connection hidden inside the data. And finally, it would come from the discarded chewing gum of the man investigators had been led to. The witnesses provided the first pieces of the story. Science provided the connection. The courtroom provided the verdict. 44 years separated the beginning from the end, but the case never completely lost its thread. Barbara had been seen that night. Her final movements had been recorded in human memory. Her biological evidence had been preserved. The clues had survived in different forms, waiting for investigators to connect them. And when they finally did, the man who had remained unidentified for decades could no longer disappear into the darkness. For more than 40 years, the identity behind the DNA recovered in Barbara Tucker's murder remained a blank space in the investigation. Detectives knew the biological evidence belonged to someone. They knew the profile could potentially identify the person responsible. But every conventional search ended at the same dead end. No direct database match, no name, no arrest, no courtroom. The evidence was real, but the identity remained hidden. Then investigators began looking at the problem differently. Instead of asking, who is this exact person? They began asking a more distant question. Who in this person's family might already be visible? That change in perspective would transform the case. Genetic genealogy was still a relatively new investigative tool when it was applied to Barbaret's case, but its potential was enormous. Unlike a traditional law enforcement database, genetic genealogy could reveal biological relationships between people who might never have met and might never have known they were connected. A distant cousin could become the first thread. That thread could lead to another branch. Another branch could lead to another generation. And somewhere inside that enormous family tree could be the person whose DNA had remained unidentified since 1980. The process required patience. Investigators had to work through genetic information, genealogical records, family relationships, and historical connections. The objective was not simply to find someone with a similar surname. Names could change. Families could move. Records could contain errors. What mattered was biological connection. Investigators needed to determine how the unknown DNA profile could fit into an existing family structure. The further they traveled through the family tree, the more possibilities appeared. Each branch had to be examined. Each potential individual had to be evaluated. Age mattered. Location mattered. Circumstances mattered. Investigators needed to determine whether a person connected genetically to the unknown profile could realistically have been in Oregon at the relevant time and could otherwise fit the circumstances of the murder. Eventually, the investigation narrowed toward Robert Arthur Plimpton. His name represented a dramatic turning point, but investigators understood that a genealogical lead was not the same thing as proof. The possibility that Plimpton was connected to the unknown DNA profile had to be tested independently. That meant surveillance. Detectives located Plimpton in Troutdale, Oregon. They watched him. They waited for an opportunity to collect an uncontaminated biological sample. Every movement mattered because the investigation depended on maintaining the secrecy of the operation. If Plimpton became aware that investigators were watching him, he might change his behavior or dispose of biological material differently. Detectives therefore needed patience. They were not simply trying to observe him. They were trying to obtain evidence that could either confirm or destroy the genealogical lead. Then came the moment that would change the case forever. Plimpton discarded a piece of chewing gum. To anyone passing by, it was meaningless. A small piece of waste, something destined for a trash bin or the pavement. But investigators recognized that it could contain DNA. They recovered it and sent it to the laboratory. The result would determine whether the decades-old investigation had finally found its answer. When the laboratory compared the DNA from the chewing gum with the DNA profile developed from evidence associated with Barbara Tucker's murder, the profiles matched. The genealogical lead had been independently confirmed. The unknown contributor was Robert Arthur Plimpton. After decades of searching, investigators finally had a name. The breakthrough was extraordinary precisely because the suspect had not been discovered through a traditional police database. He had been reached through his family tree. The genetic connection had pointed investigators toward him, and the discarded gum had provided the direct confirmation. The method illustrated how modern forensic investigation could reach into the past. A crime committed in 1980 had been investigated using technology that would have been unimaginable to the detectives working the case at the time. The original investigators could collect biological evidence, but they could not foresee the future uses of DNA. The scientists who developed the profile in 2000 could identify the genetic signature, but they could not find the person behind it through the databases then available. The later investigators had another tool. They could search beyond the suspect himself. They could search his relatives. That was the breakthrough. The killer had remained hidden because he was not necessarily present in a database, but his family connections could leave traces. Genetic genealogy exploited those connections. It did not magically reveal a name. It created a pathway. Investigators still had to follow that pathway carefully. They had to verify the result through traditional police work, and they had to build a case capable of surviving in court. But the first impossible step had been achieved. The unknown profile had become a person. On June 8, 2021, Robert Arthur Plimpton was arrested and charged with Barbara's murder. The arrest came more than 41 years after Barbara's death. For the Tucker family, it must have been an extraordinary moment. A name that had never existed in the case suddenly appeared everywhere. Police records, court documents, news reports. The man investigators believed was responsible was no longer an unknown figure somewhere in the past. He was a living defendant facing a murder charge. But an arrest after 41 years also created a strange emotional reality. The investigation had moved suddenly after decades of silence. Families can spend years adjusting to the idea that an unsolved case may never be resolved. Then one phone call can change everything. The past returns. Old memories become relevant again. Questions that seem permanently unanswered suddenly become urgent. What happened that night? Why Barbara? How did the suspect remain unidentified for so long? What had happened to the evidence? Why did it take 40 years? And most importantly, would the court agree with the investigators? Those questions would eventually be addressed during the trial. But before the courtroom, there was another important stage. Building the prosecution's case. The DNA match was powerful, but prosecutors still needed to explain the evidence in a coherent legal framework. The case had to establish that the DNA connection was not merely coincidental or unrelated to the murder. It had to be understood alongside the circumstances of Barbara's death and the other evidence gathered during the investigation. The prosecution therefore had to take a case that had been assembled over 4 decades and present it as a single narrative. That was no simple task. Evidence from 1980 had to be explained to a 21st century court. Scientific analysis from 2000 had to be connected to genetic genealogy performed decades later. Surveillance evidence had to be placed in context. The DNA from the discarded gum had to be connected to the original profile. Each piece had to fit. The defense would have an opportunity to challenge the conclusion. The court would have to determine whether the evidence met the required legal standard. This was the point where investigative certainty and legal certainty had to meet. Detectives could believe they had found Barbara Ray's killer. Scientists could say the DNA matched. Genealogists could identify a family connection. But the final decision belonged to the court. The trial eventually took place in 2024. Judge Amy Baggio heard the case. Over approximately 3 weeks, the prosecution presented the evidence that had transformed Barbara Ray's murder from a cold case into an active prosecution. The defense challenged the state's case. The judge evaluated the evidence, and after decades of uncertainty, the court reached its conclusion. On March 15, 2024, Plimpton was found guilty of first-degree murder and 4 counts of second-degree murder. The verdict confirmed what the investigation had been building toward. The man hidden behind the unknown DNA profile had finally been identified and convicted. But the most remarkable part of the story remained the way investigators found him. There was no dramatic confession, no sudden eyewitness appearance, no long-lost document revealing his name. There was a family tree. Somewhere inside a massive network of biological relationships was a connection that investigators could follow. That connection led to Plimpton. Then a piece of discarded chewing gum turned a genealogical possibility into direct forensic evidence. It is difficult to imagine a more striking contrast between the scale of the investigation and the size of the final clue. 44 years of unanswered questions eventually converged on something that could fit between 2 fingers. Yet the gum itself was not the true breakthrough. The real breakthrough was recognizing that old DNA could be used in a new way. The biological evidence had always existed. The technology had not. Once genetic genealogy became available, the investigators could search beyond the boundaries of traditional databases. The killer had been hidden not because there was no evidence, but because the evidence could not yet point directly to him. That distinction is crucial. Cold cases are sometimes described as mysteries in which every clue has disappeared. But Barbara Ray's case shows something different. The clues may still be there. They may simply be waiting for a method capable of interpreting them. The DNA profile was one such clue. It had existed for years without producing an identity. Genetic genealogy gave it direction. Surveillance gave investigators an opportunity. The chewing gum gave them confirmation. The courtroom gave them a verdict. And the sentence later imposed by the court gave the case its final legal consequence. For Barbara Ray's family, however, the discovery of Plimpton could never be just a forensic achievement. It was the identification of the man connected to the death of a 19-year-old woman whose life had been taken decades earlier. The technology was fascinating. The investigative strategy was remarkable. But at the center of it all was Barb, a daughter, a family member, a 19-year-old whose future had been stolen. Her name had survived even when the identity of her killer had not. The investigation eventually brought that identity into the light. 44 years after Barbara Ray's murder, the unknown man was no longer unknown. He had a name. He had been arrested. He had stood trial. He had been convicted, and he had been sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years. The family tree had finally revealed the branch that investigators had been searching for. The mystery had been hidden inside DNA, and after decades of silence, science had finally learned how to read it.